I discovered my daughter had legally dropped my last name and taken her stepfather's. I did not scream or demand an explanation. I simply opened my banking portal and permanently canceled her $45,000 senior year college tuition payment. A month later, she texted me demanding to know why the university had placed a financial hold on her account. I replied with a single sentence: "Ask your stepfather since you made your choice." 2 weeks later, they served me with a lawsuit. My name is Edgar Rollins. I am 70 years old, and what I am about to tell you is the story of how my silence dismantled an entire family of frauds. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who thought your kindness was a weakness. The crisp autumn air carried a sharp bite as I walked down my driveway to retrieve the morning mail. I sifted through the standard assortment of utility bills and corporate newsletters until a thick cream-colored envelope caught my eye. The return address belonged to the university registrar where my daughter was entering her senior year. I flipped the envelope over to check the recipient. The name printed in bold black ink read, Sydney Kensington. Kensington was the surname of my ex-wife Patricia's current husband, Gregory. I stood perfectly still on the asphalt. I did not crush the envelope in my fist. I did not let out a gasp or a shout of anger. The physical calmness of my body contrasted entirely with the sudden void opening in my chest. A shift in identity on an official university document was not a clerical error. It was a calculated legal declaration. I turned around and walked back into my house with measured, precise steps. I bypassed the kitchen and walked straight down the hall into my home office. I sat down in my heavy leather chair and pressed the power button on my computer tower. The gentle hum of the hard drive booting up was the only sound in the room. Every movement I made was deliberate and completely silent. I placed the envelope flat on my mahogany desk and stared at the name Kensington. I needed absolute factual verification before I reacted. I opened my web browser and navigated directly to the County Court Public Records database. I typed my daughter's date of birth and her original legal name into the search query. The system loaded for a few seconds before generating a list of filed documents. At the very top of the registry was a finalized legal petition dated exactly 3 months ago. I clicked on the digital file to read the scanned document. The paperwork detailed a voluntary petition for an adult name change. Sydney had officially stood before a municipal judge and requested to sever her ties to my lineage. She legally erased the surname Rollins entirely from her birth certificate and adopted her stepfather's name, Gregory Kensington. The legal phrasing on the document was cold and absolute. It stated that the petitioner wished to align her legal identity with the family unit she recognized as her primary emotional support. I scrolled to the bottom of the last page. The judge's bold signature finalized the decree, making the erasure of my legacy a matter of permanent public record. She had not kept my name as a middle name. She had not hyphenated it. She had excised me from her legal existence with a single stroke of a pen. Patricia and Gregory had likely celebrated this victory, assuming I would simply continue acting as their blind financial provider. They assumed my devotion was a permanent guarantee. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the framed photograph hanging on the wall above my monitor. The picture showed a younger version of myself standing proudly beside a single rusted delivery truck. That truck was the seed of the logistics empire I had built from absolutely nothing. For decades, I battled systemic barriers, secured impossible commercial loans, and worked 90-hour weeks to establish my freight company. During those grueling years, my ex-wife Patricia constantly complained about my long working hours. She resented my absence, but gleefully spent the wealth my absence generated. When our marriage inevitably fractured, I made a singular, unshakable promise to myself. I swore that the wealth I had accumulated would secure Sydney's future entirely. I established her educational trusts and financial safety nets before the divorce paperwork was even finalized. I paid for every private school, every equestrian camp, and every medical bill without a single complaint. I endured Patricia's constant hostility and Gregory's arrogant posturing solely to ensure my daughter never lacked for anything. I built a fortress of financial security around Sydney so she could walk through the world without facing the same brutal struggles I had conquered. My money was the foundation of her privileged life, and yet she had chosen to wear another man's name like a badge of honor. I did not pick up the phone to confront her. I opened a new tab on my browser and logged into my highly encrypted private banking portal. I navigated through the menus until I reached the Scheduled Transactions tab. There, listed in bright green text, was the pending $45,000 wire transfer designated for Sydney's senior year tuition. It was scheduled to automatically process in exactly 5 days. I moved my cursor over the cancellation icon. I clicked the button. A prompt appeared asking me to confirm the permanent deletion of the scheduled payment. I clicked confirm. The $45,000 transfer vanished from the screen, returning the funds securely to my primary holding account. I closed the laptop, letting the screen go black. I did not send Sydney a warning. I did not call Patricia to argue. The university's financial deadline was rapidly approaching, creating a silent ticking time bomb that they were entirely unaware of. The university would demand their payment, and the newly minted Sydney Kensington would quickly discover the true cost of discarding the man who financed her entire reality. A full month drifted by in absolute undisturbed silence. The university semester was firmly underway and the financial deadlines had come and gone. I was in my study reviewing a complex routing contract for a new fleet of refrigerated trucks when my personal cell phone illuminated on the corner of the desk. The notification displayed a text message from Sydney. I unlocked the screen and read her words. She did not start with a greeting. She did not ask how I was doing. She wrote casually, stating that she had just tried to register for a spring elective, but the university portal had blocked her. She complained that there was a financial hold on her account because the tuition balance remained unpaid. The tone of her message was entirely devoid of concern or guilt. She demanded that I call the bursar's office immediately to fix the oversight, citing the stress of her upcoming midterms and how she could not be bothered to deal with administrative errors. Her expectation was absolute. She fully believed that my money was a natural, unending resource that existed solely for her convenience, entirely divorced from the man who provided it. She had severed my legal identity from hers, but expected my financial utility to remain fully intact. I read the message a second time. The anger that had briefly flickered a month ago was entirely absent, replaced by a cold, settling clarity. I felt absolutely no obligation to explain my feelings to her. I did not owe her a justification or a lecture on respect. She had made a permanent legal declaration in a court of law, and I was simply honoring the boundaries of her new reality. I tapped the screen and typed out a single, devastatingly final reply. Ask your stepfather. You made your choice. I hit send, placed the phone face down on the heavy wood of my desk, and turned my attention back to the routing manifests. The supply chain required precision, and I had a company to run. The transaction was complete. Exactly 20 minutes later, the silence in my study was broken by the sharp ring of my phone. The caller ID displayed Patricia's name. I expected the call and I answered it calmly, placing the phone to my ear without speaking. Patricia's voice exploded through the receiver. She screamed with an intensity that forced me to hold the phone an inch away from my head. She called me a deadbeat, a vindictive coward, and a spiteful old man who was punishing his own flesh and blood over a piece of paper. She vehemently defended Sydney, claiming the legal name change was merely a symbolic gesture designed to honor Gregory, the man who, according to Patricia, had actually raised her while I was busy building my company. She justified the erasure of my legacy as a minor administrative detail that should not affect my financial obligations. I listened to her tirade without interrupting, letting her expend her rage against a wall of silence. As Patricia continued to shout, she boasted about Gregory's superior status as a provider. She reminded me that Gregory ran a supposedly highly lucrative car dealership in the city. He was a man who loved projecting wealth, frequently leasing flashy European sports cars to maintain an image of extreme success. I recalled how Gregory would often park his leased luxury vehicles aggressively close to my reliable 10-year-old pickup truck during the rare forced family gatherings, offering smug comments about my lack of style. Patricia insisted that Gregory was the real father figure, completely ignoring the reality that my silent capital had financed her entire lifestyle. I allowed her to finish her sentence, praising Gregory's wealth, and then I simply pressed the red button on my screen, hanging up the phone mid-sentence. I navigated to my settings and blocked her number permanently. I set the phone down, ready to enjoy the evening quiet. 10 minutes later, that quiet was violently shattered by a furious, aggressive banging on my front door. The aggressive knocking rattled the heavy oak frame of my front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, expecting to find Patricia standing on my porch. Instead, I found Wyatt standing under the porch light. Wyatt was Sydney's fiancé, a young white man who wore his privilege like a custom-tailored garment. Tonight he wore a sharp navy designer suit that looked entirely out of place in my quiet suburban neighborhood. He did not wait for an invitation or offer a basic greeting. He stepped forward, crossing the threshold and forcing me to step back into my own foyer. He carried an air of absolute arrogance, his jaw set in a tight, demanding line. Wyatt looked around my entryway with undisguised disdain before locking his eyes directly on mine. He immediately launched into a condescending lecture, speaking to me as if I were a subordinate employee who had failed a simple task. He demanded to know why I was playing games with Sydney's future. He ordered me to log back into my bank account and authorize the $45,000 transfer before the university canceled her enrollment. He spoke with a terrifying level of entitlement, fully believing he had the authority to walk into my home and command my finances. He crossed his arms over his chest, invading my personal space, trying to use his youth and height to intimidate me into immediate compliance. He declared that it was my fundamental obligation to pay for the life Sydney deserved, regardless of whatever petty grievances I held regarding her legal name change. He expected me to bow my head, apologize, and write the check without a single word of protest. When my silence stretched on, Wyatt's frustration morphed into vicious personal attacks. He decided to weaponize the past, digging into wounds he had no right to touch. He sneered and stated that I owed Sydney this money to make up for my chronic failures as a father. He specifically cited my absence at her high school graduation, painting me as a neglectful parent who could not even bother to show up for her most important milestone. He claimed this tuition payment was the absolute least I could do to atone for abandoning her on that specific day. I stared at him, feeling the familiar cold weight of Patricia's manipulations. Wyatt did not know the truth. He did not know that 4 years ago Patricia had intentionally emailed me the wrong venue address and a completely fabricated start time. I had driven across the state to a locked auditorium while my daughter walked across a stage 30 miles away. I had secured the digital forensics of Patricia's deception, saving the altered electronic invitations in my secure files. I could have easily exposed her cruelty to Sydney that very afternoon. Instead, I chose to absorb the blame. I remained entirely silent, swallowing the bitter injustice to protect my daughter from the devastating realization that her mother would weaponize her graduation just to inflict pain on me. I bore the title of the absent father to keep Sydney's peace intact. Wyatt was now using my silent sacrifice as a bludgeon, completely ignorant of the fact that the narrative he was reciting was a manufactured lie designed to extract my wealth. He viewed my past restraint as a glaring weakness he could exploit for a quick payout, never realizing the depth of the restraint I was currently exercising by allowing him to continue speaking. Wyatt took another aggressive step forward, mistakenly interpreting my continuing silence as submission. He jabbed a rigid finger toward my chest, which was a severe miscalculation on his part. I am 70 years old, but my physique was not built in a corporate gym. My shoulders and chest were forged by 3 decades of loading freight, hauling heavy wooden pallets, and wrestling commercial truck engines long before I ever sat in an executive boardroom. I did not raise my voice, but I shifted my weight and expanded my stance. I stepped directly into his space, forcing him to look up slightly to meet my gaze. The sudden shift in my physical presence caught him completely off guard. I did not flinch, and I did not yield a single inch of ground in my own home. I looked him dead in the eyes and spoke in a low, dangerous tone that resonated from the bottom of my chest. I informed him that he had exactly 5 seconds to remove himself from my foyer before I demonstrated exactly how a man defends his private property from an intruder. The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sharp flicker of genuine fear. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. Wyatt instinctively took a step back, his designer leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished hardwood floor. I took another step, using my sheer physical mass to herd him backward like a common trespasser. He crossed the threshold, stumbling backward onto the concrete porch. The cold night air rushed between us. I stood in the doorway, serving as a towering, impassable barrier to the wealth he so desperately thought he could command. Humiliated by his forced retreat, Wyatt lost his temper entirely. His composed corporate persona fractured into raw, petulant rage. He stood on my front lawn in the rain, beginning to spot his expensive suit, and began to shout uncontrollably. He cursed at me, declaring that my stubbornness was ruining everything they had meticulously planned. In his blind fury, he made a catastrophic tactical error. He screamed that I was destroying their future, shouting that the massive tuition refund from the overpaid student account was supposed to act as the primary seed money for his new tech startup. The words hung heavily in the damp night air. I stared at him, letting his own confession echo in the profound silence. The pieces of the puzzle instantly snapped together in my mind with brutal clarity. The desperate urgency to secure the $45,000 had absolutely nothing to do with Sydney's academic deadlines. It was an elaborate mechanism to launder my money into his business venture under the guise of an educational expense. They had orchestrated the name change to align Sydney with Gregory, and now they were trying to extract my capital to fund Wyatt's phantom ambitions. I did not say another word to him. I stepped back, grasped the brass handle of my heavy front door and firmly pulled it shut. I turned the deadbolt until it clicked solidly into place, locking him outside in the dark. I walked back toward my study, realizing that this conflict was escalating far beyond a simple tuition dispute. The scope of their fraud was rapidly expanding, and I needed to prepare for their next desperate legal maneuver. 2 weeks passed in a heavy, unbroken silence following my confrontation with Wyatt on the front porch. I spent those 14 days maintaining my strict routine, waking before dawn, reviewing the global shipping manifests for my former associates, and tending to the maintenance of my property. I knew Patricia and Gregory were not simply going to absorb the loss of $45,000. People who survive on the illusion of wealth do not retreat when their primary funding source runs dry, they escalate. The escalation arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning while I was standing in my driveway inspecting the engine belts of my pickup truck. A nondescript gray sedan pulled to a stop at the curb. A young man stepped out clutching a thick stack of manila folders against his chest. He walked up my driveway, confirmed my identity with a brief question, and thrust the heavy stack of documents directly into my chest before turning around and speeding away. I wiped the motor grease from my hands with a shop towel and broke the seal on the envelope. The bold black text of the legal summons stared back at me. Patricia and Gregory were officially suing me for breach of contract in civil court. They had attached a certified copy of the original 15-year-old divorce decree, specifically highlighting the clause that mandated I cover the entirety of my daughter's higher education costs. They were demanding the immediate execution of the $45,000 payment, alongside a request for me to cover all their exorbitant legal fees, citing my sudden financial abandonment as an act of malicious negligence. I did not waste a single second succumbing to anger or panic. I locked my house, climbed into my truck, and drove straight to the downtown financial district. I navigated the glass and steel high-rise building that housed the offices of my attorney, Simon Reyes. Simon was a brilliant and utterly ruthless corporate litigator who had helped me navigate the complex acquisitions that built my logistics empire. He understood the brutal mechanics of contracts better than any man in the city. Simon greeted me at the reception desk and escorted me into a sprawling, soundproof boardroom overlooking the city's skyline. I tossed the heavy stack of legal documents onto the polished granite table. Simon adjusted his glasses and spent the next 20 minutes reading the filing line by line in absolute silence. When he finally looked up, his expression was tight with professional calculation. He noted the unprecedented aggression of Patricia's legal filing, pointing out that she and Gregory had hired a boutique litigation firm infamous for predatory intimidation tactics. The lawsuit included a motion attempting to freeze my personal checking accounts to force a swift and desperate settlement. Simon explained that they were playing a high-stakes game of financial chicken, entirely confident that the old divorce decree was an unbreakable chain wrapping around my neck. Simon stood up from the granite table and walked over to his secure digital terminal. He pulled up the archived files containing my original divorce settlement and the corresponding trust documents we had structured over a decade ago. He cross-referenced the specific wording of the educational mandate against the new hostile lawsuit. A slow, predatory smile spread across Simon's face as he leaned back in his leather chair. He turned the monitor toward me and highlighted a critical legal distinction buried deep within the paperwork. The educational mandate and the incredibly lucrative trust fund backing it were explicitly and irrevocably established for a singular legal entity named Sydney Rollins. Simon explained the profound consequence of my daughter's recent court victory. By standing before a municipal judge and successfully filing a petition to legally sever her identity from my lineage, she had fundamentally altered her legal status. She was no longer Sydney Rollins in the eyes of the law. Sydney Kensington possessed absolutely no legal standing to claim the massive assets held within that specific private trust. Her arrogant attempt to erase my legacy had technically and legally locked her out of my vault. The ancient divorce document Patricia and Gregory were using as a weapon to sue me was now entirely unenforceable regarding the person my daughter had actively chosen to become. Simon immediately turned back to his keyboard, his fingers hovering over the keys ready to draft a motion to dismiss the lawsuit based on a complete lack of legal standing. He assured me the case would be thrown out with prejudice before a judge ever saw the inside of a courtroom. I reached across the table and placed my heavy hand firmly over his wrist, stopping his momentum. I instructed my lawyer to hold the motion and allow the fraudulent lawsuit to proceed unchecked into the discovery phase. I did not want a quick dismissal. I wanted to see exactly how far Patricia and Gregory were willing to go. I wanted them to step into a crowded courtroom place, their hands on a Bible, and commit absolute undeniable perjury on a recorded legal transcript. I wanted them to drain whatever remaining funds they possessed, paying a boutique law firm to fight a war they had already legally lost. I then gave Simon a new immediate directive. I ordered him to initiate a quiet and deeply aggressive forensic financial investigation utilizing his best private contractors. I instructed them to tear into the foundational ledgers of Gregory's luxury car dealership and fully investigate Wyatt's supposedly groundbreaking tech startup. Wyatt's furious slip-up on my front porch remained burned into my memory. I knew the demanded tuition refund was intended to be funneled into that business, and I fully intended to uncover the exact magnitude of the financial fraud my money was supposed to save them from. I returned to the absolute solitude of my study as the evening settled heavily over the quiet suburban neighborhood. The aggressive confrontation with Wyatt on my front porch and the subsequent strategic planning session with Simon had crystallized my focus into a sharp, unyielding weapon. I sat down at my heavy mahogany desk and opened my secure personal financial dashboard, determined to conduct my own rigorous preliminary audit before Simon's forensic team finalized their deeper investigation. My decades in the freight industry had trained me to spot financial irregularities hidden within massive data sets. I systematically reviewed my primary accounts until I reached a specific secondary ledger buried at the bottom of the screen. It was the statement for a high-limit emergency credit card I had issued to Sydney exactly 3 years ago. I had handed her that premium piece of plastic when she signed the lease for her first off-campus apartment, explicitly instructing her that it was reserved strictly for absolute survival necessities, like medical emergencies or sudden vehicle breakdowns. For 3 long years, the card had remained largely dormant, accumulating only minor annual maintenance fees. Tonight, the digital ledger told a drastically different story. I stared at the screen as a violent cascade of massive erratic charges flooded the recent transaction history. The purchasing activity had ignited less than 48 hours ago, precisely aligning with the moment the university officially rejected her tuition payment. The spending limit was incredibly high, designed to cover worst-case scenarios, and the available balance was currently being aggressively drained with relentless speed. Whoever held the card was swiping it with the frantic urgency of a sinking ship bailing water. I leaned closer to the monitor, analyzing the sheer volume of the authorizations as my money bled out into the digital ether. I clicked the expansion arrow on the digital ledger to reveal the highly specific merchant details for the pending authorizations. The charges were not processed at university bookstores, local grocery chains, or campus dining halls. The merchants listed on the glowing screen were entirely divorced from the reality of a struggling college senior trying to survive midterms. I saw a staggering $5,000 charge authorized to a premium enterprise cloud server hosting company. Directly beneath that line was a $1,200 bill from an elite downtown steakhouse renowned for courting corporate executives and serving Wagyu beef alongside vintage wine. The most damning item was a massive $10,000 pending transaction issued to a commercial real estate management firm distinctly flagged as a commercial lease deposit. The truth materialized on my screen with absolute crystalline clarity. Sydney had surrendered my emergency lifeline directly to her arrogant fiancé. Wyatt was blatantly utilizing my credit card to aggressively build the infrastructure for his phantom tech startup. He had stood on my front porch screaming about his business seed money, completely aware that he already possessed the physical means to steal it directly from my pocket. He was not just an entitled child demanding a handout. He was an active fraudster treating my emergency line of credit as his personal venture capital fund. He actually believed I was an oblivious old man who would simply authorize the payment at the end of the month without scrutinizing the commercial real estate and server hosting fees. He severely underestimated the absolute vigilance of a man who spent 40 years tracking lost pennies in the brutal cutthroat world of commercial freight logistics. I reached across the wide expanse of my desk and picked up my cell phone. I navigated to my contacts and highlighted the direct 24-hour emergency line for the bank's fraud department. My thumb hovered over the green call button, ready to instantly freeze the account and initiate a standard theft investigation. I stopped. I looked at the glowing monitor and realized the profound strategic value of Wyatt's breathtaking arrogance. Canceling the card would immediately cut off his illegal funding, but it would only result in a minor slap on the wrist or a family dispute over unauthorized use. I lowered the phone and bypassed the fraud department entirely. Instead, I dialed the direct extension of my private banking concierge. The representative answered immediately, recognizing my premium account tier. I did not report the credit card as stolen. I explicitly instructed the agent to leave the account entirely open and unhindered. I requested the assignment of a dedicated financial tracking agent to monitor that specific card around the clock. I ordered the bank to compile a highly detailed forensic ledger generating time-stamped receipts, IP addresses of digital purchases, and physical merchant signatures for every single transaction processed over the next 7 consecutive days. I was intentionally keeping the vault door wide open. Every time Wyatt confidently swiped that piece of plastic, he was moving further away from a simple civil dispute and stepping directly into the devastating territory of felony wire fraud and grand larceny. I was actively allowing him to construct the very prison cell he would eventually inhabit, using my money to buy the iron bars. I printed the initial batch of fraudulent transaction records and neatly arranged the crisp pages into a single manila folder. I walked over to the heavy fireproof safe bolted securely to the floor of my study, entered the complex mechanical combination, and locked the physical evidence inside. The financial trap was perfectly set, ticking silently in the background while Wyatt gleefully dug his own grave. The next morning, the sun rose over a perfectly quiet house. I was drinking my black coffee in the kitchen when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed Simon Reyes. My attorney sounded sharply amused as he relayed the morning developments. Patricia had bypassed my blocked number and contacted Simon's legal firm directly. She demanded an immediate private mediation meeting between our two factions to be held at a neutral downtown location. According to Simon, Patricia insisted the meeting was an act of mercy designed to settle things quietly before destroying my public reputation. It was a thinly veiled extortion threat wrapped in professional legal courtesy. They genuinely believed the pending civil lawsuit had successfully backed me into an inescapable corner, forcing me to negotiate a swift surrender. I instructed Simon to accept the mediation request immediately without offering any pushback. I wanted them to sit across a polished table from me, projecting their false superiority. I wanted to look Patricia Gregory and Wyatt directly in the eyes while they desperately attempted to blackmail me, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the certified digital receipts of their ongoing felonies locked securely in my safe. I told Simon to prepare the glass conference room for an absolute slaughter. The mediation took place the following Tuesday in a sterile glass-walled conference room located on the 42nd floor of a neutral downtown firm. The cold fluorescent lighting washed over the long polished oak table, highlighting the stark divide between the two sides. Patricia, Gregory, Sidney, and Wyatt sat in a row facing the sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows. They radiated a toxic, smug confidence that filled every corner of the sterile space. Patricia wore an expensive cashmere blazer, adjusting her diamond bracelets with theatrical flair, while Sidney sat beside her looking entirely bored and unapologetic. Wyatt lounged in his ergonomic chair with his legs crossed at the knee, exuding the unearned arrogance of a man who firmly believed he held a winning hand. I sat directly across from them, positioned perfectly still beside my attorney, Simon Reyes. I did not fidget, adjust my tie, or offer any performative pleasantries to ease the thick tension. I kept my hands folded, resting quietly on the cool surface of the table. The visual contrast in the room was absolute and deliberate. They were a chaotic mass of nervous energy, eager to flex their supposed leverage, while I remained as immovable as the steel beams supporting the high-rise building. Gregory puffed out his chest, attempting to physically dominate the space by sprawling his thick arms across the table. He wore a loud pinstripe suit that screamed of least luxury and artificial success. He stared at me with a mix of disdain and anticipated victory, convinced that this private setting was the perfect arena to finally break my resolve. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with unspoken resentments and decades of Patricia's manufactured grievances. I simply breathed in the conditioned air and waited patiently for their inevitable performance to begin. Gregory took it upon himself to open the negotiations, leaning heavily over the center of the table to assert his role as the alpha male of his manufactured family unit. He cleared his throat loudly, demanding the room's full attention, before launching into a practiced, heavily rehearsed monologue. He spoke with the aggressive, rapid-fire cadence of a desperate car salesman trying to close an impossible deal on the showroom floor. Gregory completely bypassed the original $45,000 tuition dispute and immediately escalated their demands to a staggering new level. He declared that the severe emotional distress inflicted upon Sydney, combined with her sudden financial instability, required a much larger comprehensive settlement. He confidently demanded a lump sum wire transfer of exactly $200,000 to drop the civil lawsuit and walk away quietly. He brazenly itemized the extortion claim, stating that the exorbitant amount would cover Sydney's remaining university expenses, a generous allowance for her ongoing emotional suffering, and the required initial seed capital for Wyatt's emerging technology enterprise. Patricia nodded vigorously beside him, acting as though this outrageous sum was a perfectly reasonable standard for a father to pay after being legally disowned. Gregory leaned back, interlocking his fingers, and smiled a greasy, triumphant smile. He fundamentally believed that my profound desire to protect my public corporate legacy would force me to surrender to their financial terrorism. He assumed that a man who had spent 40 years building a pristine business reputation would happily pay any price to prevent his ex-wife from dragging his name through the mud of a highly public courtroom. He thought the $200,000 was a cheap bargain for my continued peace of mind. Before my attorney could even address Gregory's absurd financial demand, Wyatt decided to interject and reveal the true venomous depth of their blackmail strategy. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the polished oak, and offered a sickeningly sweet, highly calculated smirk. Wyatt casually informed me that he had already drafted a comprehensive press release and compiled an extensive list of local media contacts. He explicitly threatened to go directly to the city's most aggressive journalists and blog outlets if the $200,000 did not hit his account by the end of the business week. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as he outlined his ruthless smear campaign. He promised to paint me as a deeply prejudiced, bitter, and controlling old man who maliciously cut off his daughter's education fund simply because she was choosing to marry a white man. Wyatt believed this racial accusation was his ultimate, inescapable trump card. He knew my logistics company relied heavily on municipal contracts and diverse community goodwill to maintain its market dominance. He was utterly convinced that the mere threat of a manufactured racial controversy would terrify my board of directors and force an immediate, unconditional capitulation. He leaned back in his chair, observing me with predatory satisfaction, entirely certain he had just orchestrated the perfect extortion scheme. He looked at Sydney, who offered a small, confirming smile, completely willing to let her fiancé destroy my character with a fabricated narrative of bigotry just to secure their unearned wealth. Wyatt adjusted his silk tie and waited for the panic to set in, confident that he had backed me into an absolute corner where my only viable option was a total financial surrender. I did not react to the vile racial accusation. I did not raise my voice to defend my character or justify my decades of silent, tireless provision. I remained entirely stoic, letting the heavy weight of Wyatt's extortion attempt settle into the sterile environment of the glass-walled conference room. Any emotional defense would have been a massive waste of oxygen on people who were actively trying to cannibalize my life for their own comfort. I simply turned my head slightly and gave Simon a brief, barely perceptible nod. Simon squared his shoulders and looked directly at the opposing legal counsel, who had remained uncomfortably silent and pale during the entire aggressive exchange. Simon calmly and professionally informed the opposing side that their settlement offer of $200,000 was unequivocally and permanently rejected. He stated that we would not entertain any further negotiations of any kind and expected to see them in court. Gregory's smug expression instantly evaporated, replaced by a sudden flush of genuine volatile anger. Patricia slammed her manicured hands on the table, cursing my arrogance as they all hastily gathered their belongings. Wyatt scoffed, shaking his head as he followed Sydney out of the heavy glass doors, promising over his shoulder that I would deeply regret my stubbornness by tomorrow morning. I waited until the door clicked shut and their angry footsteps faded down the carpeted hallway. Once the room was completely secure and empty, I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I withdrew my cellular phone and pressed a single hidden button on the illuminated screen. The digital timer stopped saving the high-definition audio file. I had sat in absolute silence and successfully recorded the entirety of their blatant felony extortion attempt. Wyatt wasted no time executing his malicious threat. Barely 24 hours after our mediation meeting concluded in that sterile glass room, my phone began vibrating incessantly, with alerts from colleagues, acquaintances, and industry alerts. Sydney had uploaded a highly produced, heavily edited video to every major social media platform available. I sat quietly at my desk and watched the performance unfold on my monitor. She had completely stripped away her usual designer makeup and perfectly styled hair to appear physically vulnerable, exhausted, and entirely broken. Staring directly into the camera lens with well-timed tears streaming down her face, she delivered a rehearsed monologue accusing me of severe, prolonged financial abuse and emotional abandonment. She masterfully painted the cancellation of her tuition not as a consequence of her own legal disownment, but as the cruel, vindictive act of a controlling patriarch trying to destroy her future to force her obedience. The video was a masterclass in modern digital manipulation strategically designed to incite immediate public outrage and completely bypass any factual reality. She spoke of how I had supposedly isolated her, used my wealth as a weapon of psychological coercion, and abandoned her to starve the moment she sought independence. With perfect dramatic timing, the narrative shifted to elevate Gregory. She described her stepfather as her true savior, the only man who had ever offered her unconditional love and protection from my alleged tyranny. The clip was meticulously optimized for maximum viral reach, explicitly utilizing trending hashtags to ensure my name was dragged through the digital mud. They were trying to burn my reputation to the ground, fully believing the intense heat of public shame would force me to quickly open my vault. The digital wildfire spread with devastating speed, rapidly breaching the boundaries of local gossip and actively infiltrating my professional circles. By the following afternoon, the video had amassed tens of thousands of views, heavily circulated among the tight-knit business community where I had spent decades building a pristine, untouchable reputation. The immediate fallout was not merely social, it was dangerously financial. My logistics firm was in the final, highly delicate stages of negotiating a massive multi-year municipal freight contract with the city. That afternoon, my lead project manager received a tense, abrupt phone call from the procurement office. The city council members, terrified of aligning themselves with a sudden public relations nightmare, had officially paused the contract negotiations pending an internal review. They expressed grave concerns over the optics of awarding a lucrative municipal deal to a man currently being publicly crucified as an abusive, bigoted tyrant by his own daughter. The panic quickly infected my own corporate headquarters. My private line was flooded with urgent requests for an emergency executive meeting. The board of directors, men and women I had personally appointed and enriched, were visibly shaken by the ferocious viral backlash. They sat around the mahogany conference table, frantically urging me to issue a carefully crafted public apology and a swift financial settlement to make the nightmare disappear. They viewed the crisis purely through the lens of corporate liability, begging me to pay Sydney the $200,000 she demanded simply to contain the reputational hemorrhage. They drafted a highly sympathetic press release on my behalf, asking me to swallow my pride, publicly admit fault, and appease the digital mob to save our municipal contracts from total collapse. I looked at the drafted apology letter sitting on the polished conference table, slowly picked it up, and fed the crisp white paper directly into the shredder in the corner of the room. I categorically refused to issue an apology, or engage with the public spectacle in any capacity whatsoever. The board members stared at me in horrified disbelief, failing to understand the deep, unbreakable resilience that anchored my silence. They only saw the wealthy, polished executive sitting before them today. They did not truly comprehend the blood, gravel, and endless grit it took to build this empire. When I started my freight business 40 years ago as a young African-American man with a single rusted delivery truck, I was not greeted with open arms or fair opportunities. I fought through decades of blatant systemic discrimination, predatory commercial lending practices, and active, vicious corporate sabotage from established competitors who wanted my business crushed. I had tires slashed in the dead of night, vital contracts mysteriously canceled at the 11th hour, and malicious career-ending rumors spread by rivals actively trying to bankrupt me. I survived every single one of those attacks by remaining coldly objective and refusing to surrender my dignity to appease my abusers. I knew exactly how to handle character assassination because I had survived it when the stakes were far higher and my resources were practically non-existent. I looked my terrified board members directly in the eyes and informed them that I do not negotiate with terrorists even when the terrorist happens to share my bloodline. I ordered a complete corporate blackout on the topic and maintained absolute impenetrable radio silence. Across the city, Sydney and Wyatt were gleefully interpreting my utter silence as a definitive crushing victory. In their deeply arrogant minds, my lack of a frantic public defense was a clear admission of defeat. They celebrated their viral success, fully believing they had easily won the chaotic court of public opinion and successfully terrorized me into an inevitable, humiliating submission. They assumed I was sitting alone in my house, paralyzed by the intense public shame, desperately drafting the $200,000 wire transfer to make the pain stop and save my company. The reality was entirely the opposite. Later that night, as a heavy, oppressive rain began to wash the suburban streets, a pair of bright headlights swept across my dark driveway. I opened the front door to find Simon stepping out of the shadows, shaking the freezing rain from his coat while clutching a battered leather briefcase. His usual sharp, emotionally detached corporate demeanor had been completely replaced by a grim, deeply serious intensity. We walked into my study and locked the heavy oak door behind us to ensure absolute privacy. Simon reached into his briefcase and withdrew a massive, densely packed file completely filled with bank statements, tax records, and encrypted corporate ledgers. The elite private investigator he had contracted had finally returned from his forensic deep dive into Gregory's dealership and Wyatt's startup. Simon dropped the heavy stack of documents onto my mahogany desk with a loud, definitive thud. He looked at me with cold, surgical precision and stated that the financial truth hiding behind their smug extortion attempt was infinitely worse and far more desperate than anything we had initially anticipated. Simon unclasped the brass buckles of his battered leather briefcase and meticulously spread the private investigator's findings across the broad surface of my mahogany desk. The oppressive rhythm of the freezing rain lashing against the study window provided a fitting soundtrack to the absolute financial carnage documented within the crisp manila folders. I adjusted my reading glasses and began to sift through the heavily tabulated spreadsheets and covert financial audits detailing the true state of Gregory Kensington's supposedly lucrative automotive empire. The reality was a breathtaking house of cards teetering on the edge of total collapse. Gregory's luxury car dealership was functionally and irrevocably bankrupt. The impressive European sports cars gleaming on his showroom floor were entirely leased on predatory terms and heavily leveraged against non-existent assets. He did not actually own a single vehicle on the lot. The forensic accounting revealed a labyrinth of catastrophic financial mismanagement characterized by bleeding revenue streams and massive unpaid corporate taxes. Far more dangerously, the investigator had uncovered undeniable proof that Gregory had bypassed traditional lending institutions entirely after exhausting his legal credit lines. He currently owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to an aggressive syndicate of predatory private lenders operating completely outside the bounds of the law. Gregory's entire existence, his tailored pinstriped suits, his boastful demeanor, and his arrogant claims of being the superior provider was a total fabrication built on the fragile foundation of crippling, unmanageable debt. He was a desperate, drowning man projecting an illusion of elite success while silently sinking under the immense weight of his own financial incompetence. The massive extortion attempt in the mediation room was not a strategic move to secure Sydney's future, but a desperate, frantic grasp for a lifeline to keep his own head above water. Simon wordlessly turned the page of the thick dossier, shifting the focus directly onto Wyatt and his supposedly groundbreaking technology enterprise. The private investigator had dug deeply into the corporate registry and the foundational ledgers of Wyatt's highly touted startup. The results were equally devastating and explicitly tied to Gregory's impending ruin. Wyatt's tech company did not actually exist in any tangible functional capacity. It possessed no proprietary software, no dedicated development team, and absolutely no legitimate client base. It was nothing more than a legally registered shell company, a hollow corporate facade designed exclusively to obscure illicit financial maneuvers. The intricate flow of capital mapped out by the investigator exposed a highly coordinated and desperate money laundering operation. Wyatt and Gregory were actively utilizing the shell company to seamlessly funnel untraceable funds directly to Gregory's aggressive creditors. Wyatt's frantic demand for Sydney's $45,000 tuition refund on my front porch was never intended to build a legitimate business. The massive charges accumulating on my emergency credit card for phantom server hosting fees and commercial leases were completely fabricated invoices. Every single dollar they could extract from my accounts was being systematically redirected to appease the loan sharks circling Gregory's dealership. They were bleeding my resources dry to desperately stave off violent physical retaliation from dangerous men who did not care about social media smear campaigns or polite legal boundaries. Wyatt was not a visionary entrepreneur, but a willing accomplice in a massive financial fraud, working hand in hand with Gregory to siphon my life savings just to keep the predatory lenders from arriving at their front door with baseball bats. I sat back in my heavy leather chair and let the sheer magnitude of their deception wash over me. I connected the disparate dots, locking the entire sinister picture into perfect, crystalline focus. Patricia and Gregory were not simply entitled opportunists seeking a lavish lifestyle upgrade. They were cornered, desperate criminals actively using Sydney as a highly effective human shield to extract my wealth and save themselves from absolute financial and physical ruin. They had meticulously orchestrated her legal name change, feeding her a manufactured narrative of empowerment to fully align her loyalties with the Kensington brand. They needed her firmly in their grasp to weaponize her emotional standing against my bank accounts. I realized with a heavy settling sadness that Sydney was merely a pawn in their elaborate extortion scheme. Yet she was an entirely willing participant. She had gleefully stood before a municipal judge and discarded the legacy of the man who had silently financed her entire privileged existence solely to impress a charismatic fraudster and a bankrupt stepfather. She had eagerly traded the unshakable security of the Rollins name for the shiny, hollow illusion of the Kensington lifestyle. She had filmed a tearful, manipulative video intended to destroy my business reputation without ever bothering to question the sudden, frantic urgency of Wyatt's financial demands. She was blindly serving as the primary extraction tool for a syndicate of con artists trading her authentic lineage for a front-row seat on a sinking ship. My silence had not merely exposed their greed. It had inadvertently trapped them in a collapsing, burning building of their own making. I calmly closed the thick manila folder, securing the absolute, undeniable evidence of their massive, coordinated fraud. I locked the investigative dossier securely inside my fireproof safe, alongside the time-stamped credit card receipts and the digital audio recording of Wyatt's boardroom extortion attempt. I thanked Simon for his ruthless efficiency and instructed him to head home and get some rest. I knew the viral social media storm raging outside my walls was entirely irrelevant compared to the explosive legal ammunition I now held in my possession. The public relations crisis was a temporary illusion, but the felonies they were actively committing carried permanent, devastating consequences. I slept soundly that night, anchored by the profound clarity of the truth. The next morning, the dawn brought a sudden, aggressive escalation that bypassed the civil courts entirely. As I sat in my kitchen drinking my black coffee, a certified courier arrived at my front door bearing a priority legal notification. Patricia had realized that the civil lawsuit for the tuition money and the viral public shaming were not forcing me to open my vault fast enough. Her predatory lenders were likely closing in, demanding immediate payment. Driven by absolute sheer desperation, she had filed a sudden hostile motion in the county probate court. I read the stark black text of the legal summons detailing her newest strategy. Patricia was formally petitioning a judge to grant her emergency legal conservatorship over my person and my entire estate, claiming that my refusal to pay was undeniable evidence of severe cognitive decline. She was attempting to legally seize total control of my mind, my body, and my money. Simon arrived at my house within the hour after the courier delivered the probate summons. He walked straight into my study, shedding his wet coat, and immediately began dissecting Patricia's aggressive legal maneuver. She had constructed a highly manipulative narrative perfectly tailored for a sympathetic probate judge. Simon explained that Patricia was legally framing my absolute refusal to pay Sydney's tuition and my complete radio silence following the viral video as undeniable symptoms of rapid, severe cognitive decline. In her formally submitted affidavit, she claimed that my sudden financial withdrawal was wildly out of character for a man who had provided unconditionally for over 2 decades. Furthermore, she weaponized my justifiable suspicion of Wyatt, categorizing my refusal to fund his phantom tech startup as deep-seated clinical paranoia. She painted a picture of a confused, vulnerable old man who was actively destroying his own legacy due to a deteriorating mind. Her ultimate goal was laid bare in the final pages of the legal filing. Patricia was officially petitioning the court to grant her full, unmitigated legal and financial conservatorship over my person and my entire estate. She argued that she was the only family member capable of protecting me from my own irrational decisions. By seizing conservatorship, she would gain immediate, absolute access to every bank account, trust fund, and corporate asset under my name, effectively bypassing the divorce decree, the trust's strict stipulations, and the civil lawsuit entirely. She intended to legally declare me incompetent, lock me away under supervised care, and immediately drain my life savings to pay off Gregory's violent loan sharks under the guise of managing my estate. I did not allow a single ounce of panic to cloud my judgment as Simon outlined the catastrophic implications of a successful conservatorship. Panic is a luxury reserved for those who do not possess a strategy. I recognize Patricia's motion not as a terrifying threat, but as a massive, fatal overreach. By bringing my mental capacity into a court of law, she was demanding empirical medical evidence, and I was more than willing to provide it on my own uncompromising terms. I instructed Simon to immediately leverage his extensive professional network to find the most respected, uncompromising, and entirely independent geriatric psychiatrist in the state. Within 10 minutes, Simon had secured a priority appointment with a renowned specialist completely unaffiliated with any of Patricia's local medical contacts. I approached this impending psychiatric evaluation exactly as I approached a hostile corporate audit. I needed to establish an absolute, undeniable medical baseline of my cognitive function before Patricia could attempt to introduce any fraudulent doctors or paid testimonies into the official court record. I gathered my pristine financial ledgers, the meticulous logs I kept of their extortion attempts, and the concrete evidence of Wyatt's fraudulent shell company. I prepared to walk into that clinic and clinically dismantle their manufactured narrative of my dementia. I was going to secure an ironclad medical certification of my sanity, rendering their entire legal strategy fundamentally impotent. They were banking heavily on the assumption that an older man facing extreme family trauma would naturally crumble under the psychological weight of the accusation. They failed to realize they had engaged a man who treated stress as a sharpening stone for his intellect. The clinical setting of the specialist's office was stark, intensely illuminated, and completely devoid of any comforting distractions. I sat across a polished steel desk from the psychiatrist for 4 grueling hours, subjecting myself to an exhaustive battery of rigorous cognitive, neurological, and psychological evaluations. I answered every complex logical puzzle, solved advanced mathematical sequences, and navigated intricate memory retention exercises with the sharp, relentless focus of a man fighting for his absolute freedom. I did not simply aim to pass the examination. I intended to obliterate any microscopic margin for doubt. The doctor scrutinized my emotional stability, probing my reactions to the profound betrayal inflicted by my daughter and ex-wife. I responded with calm, objective clarity, explaining my strategic financial decisions and outlining the concrete evidence of their extortion without displaying a single trace of erratic anger or clinical paranoia. When the exhaustive session finally concluded, the psychiatrist reviewed my test data with a look of profound professional respect. He informed me that I had scored flawlessly across every single diagnostic metric, placing my cognitive function within the top percentile for a man decades younger than my actual age. He officially certified that I possessed pristine mental acuity, impeccable logical reasoning, and absolute capacity to independently manage my complex financial and personal affairs. I accepted the heavy stack of certified medical documents and immediately gave the doctor one final critical directive. I explicitly instructed him to seal the official results within his secure medical vault and legally prohibit their release until they were formally subpoenaed by the court. I did not want Patricia to possess any advance warning that her entire medical argument was already dead on arrival. I returned to Simon's downtown office with the sealed medical certification effectively serving as a loaded weapon resting quietly in my briefcase. I sat down at his conference table and outlined the final devastating phase of my strategy. I explicitly ordered my attorney to let Patricia's aggressive conservatorship motion proceed completely unopposed through the initial judicial filings. Simon stared at me in temporary disbelief, warning me of the inherent risks of allowing the court to entertain her fraudulent claims even for a moment. I overruled his professional caution with absolute certainty. I wanted Patricia Gregory and Wyatt to confidently march into a recorded legal proceeding feeling entirely victorious. I wanted them to stand before a presiding judge, place their hands on a Bible, and commit spectacular, undeniable perjury by testifying to my fabricated dementia. The date for the mandatory pretrial deposition rapidly approached, bringing all parties together to formally record their testimonies under oath. Before we entered the designated legal chamber, I pulled Simon aside and issued a highly specific, deeply unconventional instruction. I told my lawyer to remain largely passive during the opposing counsel's direct questioning, and I commanded him to allow me to act slightly confused and mildly disoriented on the official record. I intended to intentionally feed their arrogant delusions, giving them just enough false confidence to fully commit to their fraudulent narrative. I was going to hand them the shovel and watch them eagerly dig a hole so deep the federal authorities would eventually have to pull them out. The trap was perfectly set, and the predators were marching blindly toward the bait. The mandated pre-trial deposition took place the following Thursday morning inside a bitterly cold, windowless conference room at the opposing counsel's downtown law firm. The environment was aggressively sterile, designed specifically to intimidate and disorient. A certified court reporter sat rigidly at the head of the long rectangular table, her fingers hovering over her stenography machine, ready to permanently record every spoken syllable. Patricia and Sydney sat directly across the narrow expanse of the table, radiating a toxic, predatory confidence. They looked at me, not as a former husband or a father, but as a wounded animal they were finally preparing to put out of its misery. Patricia's aggressive lead attorney, a man with a sharp-tailored suit and a patronizing smirk, initiated the interrogation almost immediately. He did not bother with professional pleasantries. He launched directly into a relentless barrage of deliberately hostile questions designed to rattle my composure. He aggressively interrogated me regarding the mundane specifics of my daily routine, demanding to know if I regularly forgot where I placed my vehicle keys or if I struggled to comprehend simple personal financial documents. He continuously interrupted my deliberate pauses, pressing me on my ability to manage the complex daily logistics of my corporate freight empire, while subtly implying that my recent refusal to fund Sydney's exorbitant tuition was a clear symptom of rapid cognitive decay. He repeatedly weaponized my purposeful silence, portraying my lack of emotional response to their previous extortion attempts as a severe detachment from basic reality. I sat perfectly still beside Simon, absorbing the relentless legal assault while carefully cataloging every single aggressive accusation being permanently etched into the official court record. When the opposing attorney concluded his initial aggressive probing, he formally called Patricia to provide her sworn deposition for the official record. The court reporter administered the binding legal oath requiring her to state the absolute truth under the strict penalty of perjury. Patricia placed her hand firmly on the provided Bible and swore to tell the whole truth without a single shred of hesitation. She then proceeded to spin a masterful, flawlessly rehearsed web of absolute malicious fiction. She confidently testified that I had been rapidly deteriorating for months, claiming she had personally witnessed me forgetting the names of my own long-term employees and dangerously neglecting my critical corporate responsibilities. She escalated her fabricated narrative by officially stating that my recent confrontation with Wyatt on the front porch was entirely unprovoked and characterized by severe, unpredictable physical violence. She painted herself as a deeply concerned former spouse, desperately trying to intervene before my supposed mental illness caused irreparable harm to myself and others. When Patricia finished her manufactured performance, the attorney directed his attention to Sydney. My daughter solemnly took the identical legal oath, promising to provide completely factual testimony before immediately backing up her mother's aggressive lies. Sydney produced a pair of artificial tears, staring tragically at the court reporter as she swore that during her last visit to my house, I had completely failed to recognize her chosen fiancé. She claimed I looked right through Wyatt as if he were a total stranger, exhibiting a terrifying detachment from fundamental reality. She testified that my refusal to pay her tuition was not a conscious financial decision, but the tragic, erratic action of a man whose mind was rapidly crumbling into dust. They were laying the final bricks of their own legal tomb. The hostile attorney eventually turned his predatory focus back to me, demanding my direct response to the horrific accusations my family had just officially entered into the permanent legal record. This was the precise moment I had meticulously prepared for, and I executed my strategic performance with flawless surgical precision. I did not raise my voice in righteous anger or vehemently deny their blatant fabrications. Instead, I allowed my posture to slightly collapse, releasing the rigid executive tension I usually maintained. I answered the opposing counsel's aggressive questions with agonizing slowness, intentionally letting long, uncomfortable silences stretch out before I spoke a single word. I hesitated appropriately frequently, asking the frustrated attorney to repeat his questions as if I were genuinely struggling to follow the basic thread of the conversation. I acted mildly disoriented, staring blankly at the polished conference table and giving vague, non-committal answers that perfectly fed their false narrative of cognitive decline without ever actually explicitly lying under oath. I would rub my temples, sigh heavily, and state that the recent weeks had been overwhelmingly confusing, a completely factual statement regarding their extortion that they eagerly misinterpreted as a medical confession. Simon sat beside me, playing his supporting role perfectly, occasionally leaning over to whisper useless reassurances into my ear. The opposing attorney practically vibrated with triumphant satisfaction, believing he had just successfully shattered my defenses on the official record. When the grueling deposition finally concluded, Patricia and Sydney did not even bother to hide their cruel amusement. They gathered their designer coats and leather handbags, whispering to each other and openly laughing at my apparent physical and mental frailty as they confidently exited the glass-walled conference room. They firmly believed the war was already won. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, leaving Simon and me completely alone in the chilling silence of the opposing law firm's sterile conference room. The illusion of my manufactured frailty instantly evaporated the second the room was secure. I sat up perfectly straight, realigning my tailored suit jacket while Simon offered a slow, predatory smile. We waited patiently while the court reporter finalized the digital files, ensuring we had securely obtained the certified, unedited transcript of the entire morning session. Patricia and Sydney had confidently marched into a recorded legal proceeding and officially committed massive, undeniable perjury strictly under oath. They had willfully provided sworn false testimony in an active attempt to defraud my estate, a severe felony that would permanently annihilate their credibility when we finally presented my flawless psychiatric evaluation to the presiding judge. I collected my briefcase and exited the downtown high-rise building, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air with a renewed sense of absolute lethal clarity. I walked directly to my parked pickup truck, climbed into the heavy leather driver's seat, and firmly locked the doors. The time for passive observation and silent trap setting had officially concluded. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my cell phone, dialing the direct priority extension for the elite fraud investigation unit at my primary bank. I bypassed my private concierge entirely and demanded to speak directly with the senior fraud director. I officially reported the $40,000 in accumulated server hosting fees and commercial lease deposits on my emergency credit card as completely unauthorized stolen funds. I did not simply claim the card was missing. I provided the fraud director with the exact verified digital receipts and legally named Wyatt as the primary suspect, initiating a devastating federal criminal investigation. The heavy oak doors of the county probate court swung shut, sealing us inside a meticulously quiet and deeply formal chamber. The austere environment was intentionally designed to weigh the immense gravity of a human life, but today it served strictly as the arena for Patricia's ultimate catastrophic overreach. She sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Sydney and her sharply dressed attorney, exuding a quiet, highly calculated sorrow meant to sway the bench. Gregory and Wyatt sat in the gallery just behind the low wooden partition, their faces masks of expectant greed and arrogant anticipation. The presiding judge, a stern, deeply experienced man who had spent decades dissecting complex family disputes, called the emergency conservatorship hearing to order. Patricia's lawyer immediately seized the floor, launching into an impassioned, highly theatrical appeal. He brandished the certified transcripts from our recent pretrial deposition, aggressively slapping the thick stack of papers onto the wooden podium. He vehemently argued that my own sworn testimony provided undeniable tragic proof of a rapidly failing mind. He read my intentional hesitations, my slow responses, and my manufactured confusion aloud, framing them as definitive, irrefutable evidence that I was completely detached from reality and wholly incapable of managing my substantial logistics empire. He painted Patricia as a reluctant but fundamentally necessary savior, stepping in to catch a falling man before he entirely destroyed his own legacy and ruined his family's future. With his voice echoing off the high wood-paneled walls, the attorney formally begged the court to grant Patricia immediate and absolute control over my entire financial estate to protect me from my own alleged cognitive decay. Patricia dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the grieving ex-wife to absolute perfection. I remained perfectly still, watching their fabricated house of cards reach its absolute dizzying peak. Simon rose from his chair beside me, his demeanor entirely devoid of the theatrical panic the opposing counsel had just displayed. He did not launch into a passionate counter-argument or attempt to verbally dismantle Patricia's tearful performance. Instead, he calmly approached the bench and requested permission to submit a single definitive piece of physical evidence. With deliberate surgical precision, Simon handed the judge the thick, tamper-evident envelope containing my independent psychiatric evaluation. He clearly stated for the official record that the document was a comprehensive sealed cognitive baseline conducted by the most preeminent geriatric psychiatrist in the state, performed just days prior to the recorded deposition. The courtroom fell into a tense, suffocating silence as the judge broke the heavy wax seal and extracted the crisp, highly detailed medical documents. I watched the judge's eyes carefully scan the dense pages of flawless logical reasoning scores, perfect memory retention metrics, and the doctor's absolute unequivocal certification of my pristine mental acuity. The smug color slowly drained from the opposing attorney's face as the judge lowered the paperwork and slowly removed his reading glasses. The stern judicial gaze that had previously held a trace of sympathetic concern for a declining old man instantly morphed into a glacial, furious glare directed squarely at Patricia and her legal counsel. In less than 60 seconds, the unassailable medical truth had completely vaporized their entire carefully constructed argument. The supposedly definitive deposition transcripts they had just weaponized were instantly exposed not as proof of my dementia, but as concrete, undeniable evidence of their highly coordinated perjury. Patricia's rigid posture collapsed, her manufactured sorrow evaporating into genuine wide-eyed panic. Before the opposing counsel could even attempt to salvage their thoroughly decimated legal position, Simon requested permission to submit one final piece of highly relevant context regarding the plaintiff's true underlying motives. The judge, his patience clearly exhausted by the blatant deception he had just uncovered, granted the request with a sharp, uncompromising nod. Simon produced a small digital audio player, connected it to the courtroom's evidence display system, and pressed play. The pristine, high-definition recording from the glass-walled mediation room instantly filled the silent legal chamber. Wyatt's arrogant, sneering voice echoed off the wooden walls with devastating clarity. Every single person in the room listened in absolute horrified silence as Wyatt explicitly blackmailed me, threatening to orchestrate a vicious, racially charged media smear campaign to destroy my public reputation if I did not immediately wire $200,000 to his account. The recording flawlessly captured Gregory's aggressive financial demands and Patricia's complicit agreement, completely laying bare their desperate need for cash to fund a phantom tech startup and pay off illicit predatory debts. The audio played without interruption, a damning, inescapable testament to their sheer malice and financial desperation. Sydney sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, her face draining of all color as she listened to her chosen fiancé casually wield her name and her non-existent emotional trauma as a weapon for base extortion. Wyatt, sitting in the gallery, shrank down into his seat, his previous smug confidence entirely replaced by the cold, paralyzing realization that his own arrogant words had just been broadcast directly into the official court record. The audio cut off with a sharp click, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The presiding judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel down with a violent, resounding crack that made Patricia physically flinch in her chair. His voice trembled with a profound, righteous fury as he addressed the opposing side. He unequivocally dismissed the emergency conservatorship petition with extreme prejudice, explicitly stating that it was the most egregious, bad faith abuse of the probate court system he had ever witnessed in his entire judicial career. He did not stop at simply throwing the fraudulent case out. He leaned over the elevated bench and directly addressed Patricia and Sydney. His eyes locked onto them with absolute judicial disgust. He formally announced that he was ordering an immediate comprehensive prosecutorial review of their sworn deposition transcripts. By knowingly providing fabricated testimony under oath in a deliberate attempt to defraud an estate, they had committed severe, undeniable perjury. The judge warned them that he would personally ensure the district attorney pursued the maximum allowable criminal charges for their blatant, malicious manipulation of the judicial process. Patricia opened her mouth to offer a frantic protest, but the judge silenced her with a sharp, uncompromising gesture, declaring the proceedings officially concluded. As the chaotic reality of their impending criminal prosecution settled over the plaintiff's table, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom quietly swung open. Two plainclothes police detectives, their gold badges visibly clipped to their belts, stepped into the aisle and stood silently blocking the main exit. They were not there for Patricia or Sydney. Their hard eyes locked directly onto Wyatt, who was currently attempting to slip out of the gallery unnoticed. The federal wire fraud investigation had officially caught up to him. The sharp crack of the judicial gavel still echoed off the mahogany paneling as the two plainclothes detectives moved purposefully down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy atmosphere shifted instantly from legal shock to imminent criminal consequence. Patricia and her attorney scrambled to collect their scattered documents, completely oblivious to the approaching threat. The detectives bypassed the plaintiff's table, entirely ignoring my ex-wife and her panicked legal counsel. They marched straight toward the gallery partition, their unblinking focus locked entirely on Wyatt. He had half risen from his wooden bench, his designer suit suddenly looking rumpled and ill-fitting as his flight response collided with the physical reality of the locked exit doors. The taller of the two detectives stepped seamlessly into Wyatt's personal space, producing a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He instructed Wyatt to stand up straight and place both hands behind his back. The arrogant smirk that had permanently decorated Wyatt's face for the past month dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He instinctively took a step backward, bumping into the wooden railing, but the second detective swiftly flanked him, grasping his shoulder with a firm, practiced grip. The metallic clicking of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Wyatt's wrists echoed sharply across the suddenly silent courtroom. Sydney stood frozen just a few feet away at the plaintiff's table, her tear-stained face draining of the last remaining drop of color. She watched in absolute, paralyzed horror as the man she had proudly chosen over her own lineage was physically restrained like a common street thief. The illusion of her glamorous new life was being systematically dismantled right before her eyes, replaced by the stark, undeniable reality of cold steel and impending incarceration. The lead detective did not lower his voice to spare Wyatt the public humiliation. He projected his words clearly across the open courtroom, ensuring that every single person present, including the presiding judge and the court reporter, heard the precise legal nature of the arrest. He recited the Miranda warning with practiced, methodical rhythm, informing Wyatt of his right to remain silent, a right the young fraudster had already foolishly forfeited during our recorded mediation session. The detective then formally announced the massive slate of criminal charges. Wyatt was being taken into immediate federal custody for felony wire fraud, aggravated credit card theft, and multiple counts of grand larceny. The detective explicitly cited the secondary emergency credit card account, detailing how the systematic, unauthorized extraction of $40,000 across state lines had triggered a massive financial crimes investigation. He listed the fraudulent merchant codes, loudly reading the fake commercial lease deposits and phantom server hosting fees into the open air. By funneling stolen capital through a legally registered shell company, Wyatt had crossed the threshold from simple domestic theft into a highly sophisticated federal crime. He had utilized digital banking infrastructure to execute his theft, alerting federal monitors the very moment I officially verified the transactions as stolen property. I sat quietly beside Simon, watching the devastating consequences of my strategic patience fully materialize. I had intentionally left the vault door wide open, and Wyatt had sprinted inside without a second thought. Now the heavy iron door of federal prosecution had slammed shut firmly behind him, trapping him in a labyrinth of undeniable digital evidence that no high-priced defense attorney could ever successfully explain away. The absolute finality of the federal charges broke Wyatt instantly. The carefully constructed facade of the brilliant, untouchable tech entrepreneur shattered into a million irreparable pieces. As the detectives physically turned him toward the center aisle, Wyatt began to thrash against their grip, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his fabricated dignity. Panic stripped away his loyalty in a matter of seconds. He looked wildly around the courtroom and began screaming that he was entirely innocent. His voice cracked as he desperately pointed his cuffed hands toward the gallery, aiming his frantic accusations directly at his future father-in-law. Wyatt loudly and publicly confessed that the entire extortion scheme was completely orchestrated by Gregory. He shouted to the detectives and the lingering judge that Gregory had violently forced him to steal the money to pay off aggressive, dangerous loan sharks who were actively threatening the automotive dealership. Wyatt babbled uncontrollably, spilling the exact details of Gregory's catastrophic financial ruin and the impending threats of physical violence from the predatory lenders. He desperately attempted to trade Gregory's freedom for his own, offering himself up as a helpless victim of a tyrannical patriarch, rather than the willing, enthusiastic architect of my attempted destruction. His panicked confession echoed off the high ceiling, neatly connecting the dots between the fraudulent conservatorship attempt, the stolen $40,000, and the desperate need for immediate cash. In his frantic bid to avoid a federal prison sentence, Wyatt had willingly set fire to the entire Kensington family alliance, confirming every single detail of the private investigator's forensic report out loud on the public record for the local authorities to hear. The united family front that had marched so confidently into the courtroom less than an hour ago disintegrated into absolute spectacular chaos. Gregory, realizing that his own hand-picked protege had just publicly handed him over to the authorities, abandoned his manufactured alpha male persona entirely. He spun around and attempted to quietly sprint toward the heavy wooden side doors of the chamber, desperately hoping to slip away before the police could process Wyatt's frantic confession. He did not make it past the front row of the gallery. The second plainclothes detective effortlessly intercepted Gregory, slamming a heavy hand squarely into the center of his chest and shoving him forcefully back into a wooden bench. The detective firmly informed Gregory that he was now officially detained for intensive questioning regarding his connection to the illicit loan sharks, the systemic financial extortion, and his direct complicity in the grand larceny scheme. Patricia stood trembling near the plaintiff's table, her hands covering her mouth as she watched her new husband being manhandled by law enforcement. Sydney remained completely paralyzed in the center of the room. The glamorous, wealthy family she had so eagerly adopted had just completely destroyed themselves in a matter of minutes, turning on each other like cornered rats the second the consequences became real. She possessed no trust fund, no protective fiancé, and no powerful stepfather to shield her from the incoming wreckage. Slowly, heavily, Sydney turned her gaze across the chaotic courtroom, her tear-filled eyes locked directly onto mine, searching for any lingering trace of the father she had so ruthlessly discarded. I did not break eye contact, nor did I offer a single ounce of comfort. I simply gathered my coat and turned my back on the ruins. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoing in the hallway did not entirely extinguish Patricia's desperate greed. The absolute devastation of her new family unit should have signaled a complete surrender, but a cornered predator rarely yields gracefully. As the shock of Wyatt's arrest and Gregory's detention settled over the chaotic courtroom, Patricia's sharply dressed attorney scrambled to salvage the only remaining asset they had left to target. He frantically pivoted back to the original civil lawsuit, demanding the presiding judge enforce the rigid stipulations of the decades-old divorce decree. He argued vehemently that regardless of the severe criminal proceedings currently unfolding against Wyatt and Gregory, my absolute legal obligation to fund Sydney's expensive university education remained entirely intact and legally enforceable. He raised his voice, his face flushed with professional desperation, insisting that my vast corporate fortune must still be tapped to secure her future. He painted Sydney as the innocent victim of collateral damage who deserved immediate financial restitution, conveniently ignoring the undeniable fact that Sydney had actively participated in the fraudulent conservatorship scheme just moments prior. Patricia stared at me across the center aisle, her face a rigid mask of furious entitlement, entirely expecting the judge to grant her this final parting victory. She needed that $200,000 more than ever, now desperately hoping to use my wealth to hire criminal defense attorneys for the men who had just been dragged out of the building by law enforcement. The lawyer pounded his fist against the heavy wooden podium, declaring that a father's financial duty transcended any family dispute, and demanded the court force me to liquidate my assets immediately to satisfy the extortionate tuition invoice. Simon stepped forward with the calm, lethal grace of an executioner delivering the final blow to their crumbling empire. Simon formally established for the court record that the educational trust fund in question contained highly specific, immutable legal stipulations that governed the dispersal of any capital. He explained that the account was strictly and irrevocably bound to a singular legally defined beneficiary explicitly named Sydney Rollins. He then directed the judge's attention to the primary document he had just submitted. It was the finalized court-certified name change petition. Simon clearly articulated that the exact moment Sydney stood before a municipal judge and legally discarded my surname to adopt the Kensington identity, she completely and permanently severed her legal tie to the trust. The financial vehicle was designed exclusively to educate my daughter, and legally speaking, my daughter no longer existed. By eagerly trading her authentic lineage for the hollow prestige of Gregory's fabricated lifestyle, Sydney had willingly and permanently voided the contract. She had locked herself out of her own inheritance without a single ounce of outside interference. The judge reviewed the time-stamped municipal decree and nodded in absolute agreement, recognizing the undeniable legal boundary. Sydney sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, the devastating realization washing over her pale face. She had gleefully orchestrated her own financial disinheritance solely to impress a family of con artists. Patricia's jaw dropped in stunned silence, her last desperate grasp for my resources slipping entirely through her fingers as the court acknowledged the fatal error. I stepped forward to directly address the court, ready to deliver the ultimate crushing payoff to a war they had so foolishly initiated. The opposing attorney had repeatedly referenced my vast corporate fortune, banking their entire civil strategy on the misguided assumption that my logistics empire was a stationary target waiting to be plundered. I spoke with absolute objective clarity, looking directly at Patricia as I methodically dismantled her final illusion of control. I revealed that the massive logistics corporation she thought she held a lingering stake in no longer existed in any domestic capacity. I had quietly and legally sold the entire enterprise to a massive international conglomerate over 2 years ago. Patricia had spent the last 24 months obsessively tracking the public movements of a ghost ship, entirely unaware that the hull was completely empty. I explained to the silent courtroom that the total liquid proceeds from the lucrative corporate buyout had been immediately and legally placed into an impenetrable offshore trust residing in a jurisdiction entirely outside the reach of local civil courts and predatory ex-wives. I had meticulously insulated my entire life savings the moment I recognized the sheer depth of their financial entitlement. Every single dollar was locked tightly behind layers of international corporate protection, completely inaccessible to any domestic lawsuit or hostile family extraction attempt. The lucrative target they had spent tens of thousands of dollars trying to hit was nothing more than a manufactured phantom. I watched the absolute staggering weight of this revelation crush Patricia's remaining composure. She had waged a brutal, scorched earth legal campaign against a fortress that had been completely empty the entire time. I clearly articulated to the presiding judge that there was absolutely no accessible domestic capital left to sue for, rendering their entire civil litigation fundamentally pointless. Patricia and Gregory had drained their own fragile resources, taking out massive personal loans and accumulating crippling legal fees to fund a hostile takeover of an empty vault. The judge did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He struck his heavy wooden gavel and officially dismissed the civil lawsuit with extreme prejudice, terminating their final desperate bid for my wealth and permanently closing the case. Patricia collapsed heavily into her chair, her hands shaking uncontrollably as the absolute reality of her complete financial ruin settled over her. She had willingly traded a life of quiet, guaranteed stability for a catastrophic mountain of unmanageable debt. I walked out of the courtroom, leaving them behind to face the devastating consequences of their own unbridled greed. Later that exact same afternoon, the true cost of their failure materialized with brutal, undeniable speed. With Wyatt federally incarcerated, Gregory detained by local authorities, and the extortion scheme entirely dead, the aggressive private syndicate finally moved to collect their owed capital. By sunset, Gregory's violent creditors officially filed a massive, highly public commercial lien against his luxury automotive dealership. The gleaming European sports cars he had proudly paraded as proof of his elite success were abruptly chained down and seized by aggressive collection agents. The arrogant illusion of the Kensington Empire was completely dead, and the predators had finally arrived to claim what was rightfully theirs. The morning sun offered no warmth to the chaotic scene unfolding on the showroom floor of Gregory's luxury auto dealership. Gregory moved frantically between the gleaming chassis of the European sports cars, his tailored suit jacket discarded and his silk tie pulled loose in a sweat-drenched panic. The massive commercial liens filed by the syndicate had effectively frozen his legitimate operations, completely locking him out of the standard banking systems he relied on to float his predatory leases. He was currently attempting to execute a series of highly illegal, off-the-books cash sales, desperately calling shady contacts and bottom-feeder liquidators to move the inventory for pennies on the dollar. He needed immediate untraceable capital to secure bail for Wyatt and to retain high-powered criminal defense attorneys for both of them before the federal investigators began offering plea deals. Wyatt was currently sitting in a holding cell, entirely capable of turning state's evidence and testifying against Gregory to save himself from a decade in federal prison. Gregory barked frantic orders at his remaining sales staff, demanding they forge backdated transfer documents to bypass the collection agents circling the perimeter of the lot. The showroom, once a pristine monument to his arrogant financial posturing, had devolved into a frantic war room of absolute failure. Salesmen quietly packed their personal belongings into cardboard boxes, ignoring his frantic, spittle-flecked commands as they recognized a sinking ship. Gregory pounded his fist against the hood of a leased convertible, shouting into his cell phone as another gray market buyer hung up on him. His illusion of unassailable wealth had completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cornered fraudster suffocating under the crushing weight of his own criminal incompetence. The heavy glass doors of the showroom swung open, interrupting Gregory's frantic phone calls and immediately bringing the chaotic liquidation efforts to a dead halt. A sharply dressed corporate representative stepped onto the polished tile floor, flanked seamlessly by 4 imposing private security contractors clad in tactical gear. The security personnel immediately fanned out, taking strategic positions at the main entrances and completely blocking Gregory's remaining staff from moving any vehicles or accessing the management offices. The representative carried a sleek leather portfolio and projected an aura of absolute uncompromising authority. He walked directly toward the center of the showroom, bypassing the gleaming inventory, and approached Gregory with a crisp, formal lockout notification. Gregory instantly erupted into a volatile, defensive rage, his face flushing crimson as he aggressively marched toward the intruders. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding they immediately vacate his private property and threatening to call local law enforcement to have them arrested for criminal trespassing. He wildly gestured toward his glass-walled office, loudly claiming he possessed a valid, ironclad commercial lease that guaranteed his absolute right to operate his business without external interference. He puffed up his chest, attempting to deploy the same arrogant intimidation tactics he had used in the mediation room, insisting that he was a powerful, untouchable business owner who would bury them in aggressive litigation. The corporate representative did not flinch, blink, or offer a single defensive argument. He merely stood his ground, letting Gregory's hysterical threats echo uselessly off the high ceilings and glass walls of the showroom. Gregory was screaming at a tidal wave, entirely unaware that the water had already crashed over his head. When Gregory finally paused to draw a ragged breath, the corporate representative calmly opened his leather portfolio and extracted a single heavily certified document. He did not present a court order or a collection mandate from the predatory lenders. He handed Gregory the official notarized property deed to the exact parcel of commercial land sitting directly beneath the dealership. As Gregory snatched the paper and scanned the bold legal print, the representative clinically dismantled the final pillar of his fabricated empire. He revealed a critical financial truth I had quietly buried half a decade ago. 5 years prior, the original owner of this prime commercial real estate had filed for catastrophic bankruptcy, quietly putting the acreage up for emergency liquidation. I had recognized a highly lucrative investment opportunity and immediately instructed my holding company to acquire the land entirely in cash. I intentionally shielded the acquisition behind layers of corporate anonymity, allowing the existing commercial tenants to simply continue paying their monthly rent to a faceless property management firm. Gregory had spent the last 5 years writing substantial, exorbitant rent checks every single month directly into my corporate accounts, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively funding the very man he privately mocked as an uncultured blue-collar worker. I was not merely his wife's former husband. I was the absolute legal owner of the ground he stood on. I was, and had always been, his direct commercial landlord. Gregory stared at the unassailable property deed in his trembling hands, watching the ink spell out the name of my holding company. The absolute totality of my silent financial dominance crashed down upon him, completely vaporizing his arrogant assumption that he held the superior position in our family dynamic. Before Gregory could even attempt to process the staggering reality of his property arrangement, the representative produced a second, far more devastating legal document. He formally served Gregory with an immediate, non-negotiable 30-day eviction notice. The representative methodically cited a highly specific airtight morality and criminal conduct clause buried deep within the fine print of the original commercial lease agreement. Gregory's highly publicized federal wire fraud connections, his active criminal conspiracy with Wyatt, and the massive commercial liens filed by an illegal lending syndicate constituted a catastrophic breach of his tenancy contract. The representative explicitly informed him that my holding company was exercising its absolute legal right to terminate the lease and seize the physical premises to protect the integrity of the real estate asset. Gregory was legally commanded to clear the lot, surrender the keys, and permanently vacate the property within 30 days or face immediate physical removal by local law enforcement. The crisp piece of paper slipped from Gregory's trembling fingers, fluttering slowly to the polished showroom floor. The private security team immediately began directing his remaining staff to exit the building, systematically locking down the facility. Gregory stood completely paralyzed among the frozen seized sports cars, his tailored suit hanging off his suddenly hollow frame. The crushing realization settled deep into his bones. I had not engaged in screaming matches, public arguments, or dramatic confrontations. I had simply stepped back, gathered my resources, and leveraged the absolute silent power of undeniable financial ownership. I had entirely dismantled his fake millionaire lifestyle, his fraudulent business operations, and his freedom without ever raising my voice or losing my composure. The trap had not just closed around him. It had completely crushed him. The heavy iron doors of the federal holding facility temporarily yielded for Wyatt after his frantic, humiliated parents mortgaged their own modest retirement savings to secure his exorbitant bail. He arrived back at the Kensington estate not as the swaggering tech visionary who had left it, but as a cornered, desperate fugitive staring down the barrel of a decade in federal prison. The front door slammed shut behind him with a resonant thud, signaling a permanent shift in the atmospheric pressure of the house. Sydney rushed into the foyer, her face stained with days of relentless crying, expecting a tearful reunion or a unified front against her father. Wyatt did not even acknowledge her physical presence. He walked directly past her outstretched arms as if she were a ghost, his eyes locked in a terrifying hollow stare. He marched straight up the sweeping mahogany staircase to the master guest suite and immediately began ripping his expensive designer suits from their velvet hangers. He hurled cashmere sweaters and Italian leather shoes into an oversized hard-shell suitcase with violent, jerky movements. The arrogant facade had been entirely stripped away, replaced by the vicious primal instinct of a predator trapped in a burning cage. Every movement he made was calculated for maximum efficiency and immediate escape. He did not care about the shattered family dynamic or the emotional wreckage he was leaving in his wake. The suffocating reality of the impending federal indictment had completely consumed his mind, eroding any lingering trace of the manufactured charm he had used to infiltrate the Kensington household. He shoved his gold watches and stolen electronics into his duffel bag, his breathing ragged and heavy. Sydney stood trembling in the doorway, watching the man she had traded her entire lineage for systematically erase his existence from her life. Sydney stumbled after him as he dragged his heavy luggage down the staircase and out into the sprawling circular driveway. The cold evening air bit at her skin, matching the absolute freezing reality of his departure. She grabbed his arm, her voice cracking as she frantically begged him to stay, pleading that they could fight the federal charges together if they just remained a united front. Wyatt stopped dead in his tracks and turned to face her, his features twisted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. He yanked his arm free from her desperate grip with a forceful jerk. He did not offer empty platitudes or gentle apologies. He looked her directly in the eyes and clinically dismantled her remaining illusions. He explicitly told her that she possessed absolutely no inherent value to him without direct access to her father's massive logistics fortune. He coldly outlined the brutal truth, stating that she was nothing more than a highly gullible extraction tool that had completely outlived her usefulness the exact second the offshore trust was revealed. He called her a devastating legal liability, a dead weight, tying him to a sinking ship of perjury and failed extortion. The cruelty in his voice was surgical, designed to sever the relationship permanently and without any room for misinterpretation. An unmarked black sedan pulled into the driveway, its headlights illuminating the sheer devastation on Sydney's face. Wyatt forcefully threw his heavy bags into the trunk of the waiting Uber and climbed into the back seat without a single backward glance. The vehicle accelerated down the long driveway, its red taillights disappearing into the darkness, leaving Sydney standing completely alone in the freezing night. She had discarded a father who would have moved mountains for her, only to be tossed aside by a common criminal the moment the money vanished. The biting chill of the evening finally forced Sydney to turn away from the empty driveway and retreat back inside the sprawling, silent mansion. The house, once a bustling monument to fake elite prestige, now felt like a suffocating mausoleum. She walked slowly into the formal living room and found Gregory slouched deep into a leather armchair, entirely swallowed by the oppressive shadows. He held a half-empty bottle of cheap liquor, the expensive scotch having been consumed days ago, staring blankly at the wall with the shattered posture of a man who had lost his business, his freedom, and his pride in a single afternoon. He did not speak or even look up as she entered the room, completely paralyzed by the impending threat of federal prosecution and violent loan sharks. Down the hallway, Patricia's frantic, shrill voice echoed from the confines of her home office. Sydney stood in the doorway, watching her mother desperately cycle through a Rolodex of high-powered criminal defense attorneys. Patricia was begging for immediate legal representation to fight the impending perjury and fraud charges handed down by the probate judge. The calls all ended in the exact same humiliating manner. Every reputable lawyer she contacted demanded an exorbitant six-figure cash retainer up front before they would even consider touching a toxic, highly publicized federal conspiracy case. Patricia slammed the receiver down repeatedly, weeping in pure terror as attorney after attorney firmly refused her desperate pleas for leniency. The vast, limitless resources she had arrogantly counted on extracting from my accounts were gone, leaving her entirely defenseless against the crushing weight of the judicial system. The Kensington family, built entirely on predatory greed and arrogant entitlement, was rapidly devouring itself from the inside out. Sydney drifted away from the chaotic collapse of her mother's office and wandered aimlessly into the massive marble-countered kitchen. The deafening silence of her ruined reality pressed heavily against her eardrums. She moved toward the central island, her eyes falling upon a thick, disorganized stack of mail that had been aggressively ignored over the past week of legal warfare. Resting prominently on the very top of the pile was a stark official envelope bearing the unmistakable bold red lettering of a priority bank notification. With trembling fingers, she tore open the heavy paper and pulled out the crisp, legally binding document. It was a formal, non-negotiable foreclosure notice addressed directly to Gregory. The severe text outlined a massive trail of deeply delinquent mortgage payments, explicitly stating that the bank was officially seizing the physical property by the end of the current month. The sprawling, luxurious estate that had lured Sydney away from her authentic life was just another heavily leveraged illusion, completely funded by predatory debt and empty promises. The paper slipped from her hands, landing softly on the cold marble surface. She stood entirely frozen in the center of the dark kitchen, the absolute totality of her disastrous choices finally crashing down upon her. She possessed no university degree, having willingly allowed her tuition deadline to pass while participating in a fraudulent extortion scheme. She had absolutely no access to financial resources, her trust fund permanently voided by her own arrogant name change. She had no protective fiancé, no stable family unit, and in less than 30 days she would have absolutely nowhere to live. The catastrophic trap she had gleefully helped set for her father had snapped shut firmly and permanently on her own neck. The atmospheric pressure dropped sharply as a brutal, oppressive rainstorm swallowed the city, lashing against the thick glass of my study windows. The violent weather raging outside stood in stark contrast to the absolute, unshakable tranquility I had finally secured within my walls. I sat deeply settled into my worn leather armchair, the quiet crackle of the hearth fire providing a soothing, rhythmic soundtrack to my evening. A cup of steeped Earl Grey tea rested on the mahogany side table, sending thin ribbons of steam into the cool air. I held a thick leather-bound historical biography in my hands, absorbing the tactical triumphs of ancient generals who understood the fundamental necessity of patience and strategic silence. For the first time in years, my mind was entirely free from the suffocating anxiety of financial extraction and the toxic, draining drama of my former family. The massive corporate empire I had built was safely insulated offshore, completely out of reach. The fraudulent conservatorship had been decisively crushed in a court of law. Wyatt was sitting in a federal holding cell, and Gregory was rapidly sinking under the immense, crushing weight of his own illicit debts and my unyielding eviction notice. I turned the crisp page of my book, savoring the profound stillness of a life finally swept clean of parasites. Then the sharp, sudden chime of the front doorbell echoed through the silent hallway. It was a jarring, abrasive intrusion into my hard-won peace. I did not immediately rise. I let the chime ring a second time, slowly closing my book and placing it beside my teacup. I knew exactly who would be standing on my porch in the middle of a freezing torrential downpour. I walked down the long corridor, my footsteps steady and unhurried. I gripped the heavy brass handle and pulled the thick oak door open, letting the freezing wind-driven rain wash over the threshold. Sydney stood shivering violently on the exposed slate porch. The arrogant, untouchable heiress who had confidently mocked my mental acuity in a sterile deposition room just weeks ago had completely vanished. In her place stood a broken, terrified young woman bearing the full, catastrophic weight of her own disastrous choices. Her expensive designer silk blouse clung to her skin, completely ruined by the relentless downpour. The immaculate, carefully contoured makeup she wore to project an illusion of elite superiority was smeared in dark, chaotic streaks down her pale cheeks. Her teeth chattered audibly, and she hugged her arms tightly across her chest, seeking a warmth that the freezing night aggressively denied her. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation, crying uncontrollably as the rain plastered her matted hair against her face. She stepped forward instinctively, expecting the door to swing wide open to welcome her back into the comfortable sanctuary she had so ruthlessly discarded. She choked on her own tears, begging me in a thin, fractured voice to let her come inside out of the brutal storm. She pleaded for a towel, for a warm fireplace, for the unconditional safety she had previously weaponized and destroyed. She reached out a trembling, soaked hand, fully anticipating that my parental instincts would immediately override my logic and erase the devastating betrayals she had willingly participated in. She expected the foolish, compliant father to instantly rush to her rescue, blindly ignoring the fact that she had actively tried to lock him in a psychiatric ward just to drain his bank accounts. She expected a savior, but she was looking at a fortress. When I did not immediately step aside to grant her entry, Sydney launched into a frantic, hyperventilating apology, her words tumbling out in a desperate, muddy stream. She immediately began shifting the absolute totality of the blame onto everyone else, frantically attempting to rewrite the history of her own malicious actions. She sobbed heavily, claiming she had been entirely brainwashed by Patricia's relentless manipulation and Gregory's toxic, fake millionaire bravado. She swore that Wyatt had coerced her into participating in the extortion scheme, painting herself as a helpless, naive victim caught in their criminal crossfire. She looked at me with wide, pleading eyes, insisting with fierce desperation that she never genuinely wanted to change her legal surname to Kensington. She claimed the courtroom name change ceremony was a massive, tragic mistake forced upon her by her mother's aggressive social climbing. She begged for her old life back, pleading for the familiar comfort of her childhood bedroom upstairs. She wildly promised to officially revert her name back to Rollins tomorrow morning, swearing she would be the perfect, obedient daughter if I would just open the door and save her this one final time. She offered a flurry of empty, panicked promises, vowing to cut all ties with Patricia and never speak to Wyatt again. She was attempting to trade cheap, heavily rehearsed remorse for a lifetime of free financial security. She stood in the freezing rain, desperately selling a fabricated version of her own innocence, completely ignoring the fact that she had willingly sat in a sworn deposition and coldly lied to a judge about my mental competence. She wanted a complete reset, a magical erasure of the devastating consequences she had eagerly triggered simply because she was finally feeling the cold sting of reality. I did not move a single inch. I stood planted firmly on the threshold, my solid frame completely blocking her path into the warmth and safety of my home. I looked down at her drenched, shivering form without a single trace of righteous anger, but also without a microscopic shred of residual warmth. The fierce, protective, fatherly instinct that had driven me to labor for decades to secure her future had been surgically excised the exact moment she committed perjury to lock me away. I let the freezing rain fall heavily between us, the icy droplets splashing onto the hardwood floor near my leather shoes. I listened to the final pathetic echoes of her frantic apologies fade into the stormy night, leaving only the sound of the howling wind. Her desperate performance required a gullible audience, and that man simply no longer existed. I looked directly into her terrified, calculating eyes, stripping away the remaining layers of her manufactured victimhood. I did not raise my voice or offer a lengthy lecture on morality. I simply asked her one final pointed question that completely shattered her entire desperate narrative. I asked her exactly which front door she would be knocking on tonight if Wyatt had successfully extorted the $200,000 and Gregory had miraculously paid off his violent loan sharks. The stark, undeniable truth hung heavily in the freezing air between us. If their criminal conspiracy had actually succeeded, she would be gleefully sipping champagne in a luxury penthouse, entirely content with having destroyed my life to fund hers. She was not crying on my porch out of genuine remorse for her betrayal. She was crying strictly because she was out of money and out of options. I waited for her answer, letting the silence condemn her. I did not raise my voice or offer any physical comfort to the trembling young woman standing on my porch. The freezing rain continued to whip around her fragile frame, but I remained an immovable barrier against the elements she had brought to my doorstep. I simply looked at her smeared makeup and soaked designer clothing, letting the heavy silence stretch between us until her frantic apologies completely died out. When the only sound left was the violent wind, I asked her a single clinical question. I instructed her to look me directly in the eyes and clearly state her full current legal name. Sydney visibly flinched as if I had struck her. She hesitated, her jaw trembling violently as the freezing rain plastered her ruined hair to her pale cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She knew exactly what the admission meant. Finally, choking on a fresh wave of desperate sobs, she cried out that she was officially Sydney Kensington. The stolen surname hung in the icy air, a permanent monument to her ultimate betrayal. The moment the name left her lips, she frantically lunged forward, grabbing the heavy wooden doorframe as she swore to reverse the damage. She promised wildly that she would be standing outside the municipal courthouse the exact second it opened tomorrow morning. She swore she would file the paperwork, pay the administrative fees, and legally change her name back to Rollins. She begged me to accept the gesture as proof of her renewed loyalty, pleading that a simple legal document did not define her true family. She desperately tried to erase months of calculated cruelty with a single panicked promise, hoping my parental affection would override the undeniable reality of her choices. I did not accept her frantic bargaining or acknowledge her sudden, convenient desperation to reclaim her heritage. I kept my posture entirely rigid, meeting her tear-filled gaze with the clinical detachment of a judge delivering a final verdict. I calmly informed her that genuine respect and familial loyalty are not simply garments you can casually discard when the sun is shining and frantically throw back on the moment a storm arrives. I explained that she had not made a temporary mistake or a fleeting error in judgment. She had executed a calculated, methodical, and legally binding decision to completely eradicate my identity from her life. She had willingly stood before a judge and renounced her own legacy, eagerly severing herself from the bloodline that had provided for her every need since the day she was born. I reminded her of the absolute ease with which she had traded her authentic family history for the hollow, glittering illusion of the Kensington Empire. She had eagerly tossed me aside when she believed I was just a useless, obsolete old man, lacking the glamorous wealth and elite status she so desperately craved. She had laughed in a deposition room, perfectly willing to lock me inside a psychiatric ward just to secure her own financial independence. I methodically laid out the stark reality of her actions, ensuring she completely understood that her current tears were born of financial ruin, not moral regret. She had chosen her new family with absolute certainty when the sky was clear and the bank vaults seemed full. Now that the Kensington illusion had violently shattered and the money had completely vanished, she was simply running back to the only viable shelter left. I let the cold reality of her absolute betrayal settle into the freezing space between us. Sydney stood completely paralyzed, the desperate bargaining dying in her throat as she realized I was completely immune to her emotional manipulation. I spoke with a quiet, undeniable finality, telling her that in the adult world she had so eagerly tried to conquer actions carried permanent, irreversible consequences. The protective bubble I had maintained around her entire existence had been permanently popped by her own hands, and I would not artificially inflate it again. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored vest and extracted a small, rigid piece of plastic. I held it out into the rain. It was a prepaid keycard for an extended stay hotel located on the other side of the city, fully funded for exactly 7 days. Sydney stared at the plastic card, her hands shaking so violently she could barely lift her arm to take it from my grasp. I explicitly informed her that this was the absolute final financial transaction she would ever receive from the Rollins estate. The card provided her with 1 single week of a dry bed and a locked door. After those 7 days expired, she would be entirely responsible for her own survival. I told her that she needed to discover the true value of $1, the crushing weight of a heating bill, and the uncompromising reality of earning a living. I instructed her to go out and build her own life entirely from nothing, brick by brick, utilizing her own sweat and endurance, exactly as I had done 40 years ago when I started my logistics company with empty pockets and a singular vision. Sydney clutched the plastic hotel keycard against her soaked chest, her eyes wide with the crushing, terrifying realization that her safety net was permanently gone. She opened her mouth, desperately searching for one final argument, one last emotional trigger that could bridge the massive chasm she had carved between us. I did not give her the opportunity to speak. I looked at the daughter I had fiercely loved and tirelessly protected for over 2 decades, feeling the absolute finality of our severed bond. I simply told her goodbye. The word carried no malice, no lingering rage, and no hidden invitation for future reconciliation. It was an entirely objective conclusion to a closed chapter. I stepped backward into the warm, illuminated foyer and slowly pushed the heavy oak door shut. The thick wood smoothly sealed out the violent roar of the wind, the freezing rain, and the pathetic, muffled sounds of Sydney's continued sobbing. I reached out and engaged the heavy brass deadbolt, the sharp metallic click echoing decisively through the empty entrance hall. I turned my back on the entryway and walked steadily down the corridor, feeling the tension permanently drain from my shoulders with every step. I returned to my quiet, dimly lit study, the fire still crackling cheerfully in the stone hearth. I sat back down in my worn leather armchair and picked up my historical biography, finding my exact place on the page. The sprawling mansion was now completely silent, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of anticipation or the empty, echoing void of a fractured family. It was a profound, unshakable, and fiercely protective peace. I was finally truly alone, and the fortress was completely secure. The brutal, oppressive rainstorm that had violently washed over the city finally broke just before dawn, leaving behind a crisp, bitterly cold morning and skies of unbroken, brilliant blue. The fierce winds had entirely scoured the heavy clouds away, mirroring the absolute clarity that now defined every aspect of my life. I was sitting at my kitchen island, calmly reading the morning Financial Times and enjoying the profound quiet of my highly secure home when my encrypted mobile phone vibrated sharply against the granite countertop. It was Simon. His voice was characteristically calm, projecting the clinical efficiency of a man who had flawlessly executed a highly complex legal strategy. He informed me that the final municipal decrees regarding my daughter's formal name change had been fully processed and officially recorded by the state legal apparatus. Consequently, the meticulous legal paperwork required to formally dissolve the Sydney Rollins Educational Trust was completely prepared and sitting on his mahogany desk awaiting my final authorizing signature. The trap had been completely sprung, the legal mechanisms had engaged flawlessly, and the final administrative sweep was ready to be executed. I thanked Simon for his impeccable diligence, finished my coffee, and walked out into the bright, freezing morning. I bypassed the heavily armored Maybach, opting instead to drive my unassuming daily commuter vehicle through the quiet suburban streets toward the towering glass and steel architecture of the downtown financial district. The drive was incredibly peaceful, completely devoid of the suffocating anxiety and emotional turmoil that had aggressively dominated my existence over the past several months. I was simply a man on his way to close an obsolete bank account, permanently erasing the last remaining financial tether to a fabricated family that no longer legally existed. The atmosphere inside Simon's expansive corner office was quiet and intensely professional. He slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the polished surface of his desk, silently presenting the heavy stack of legal dissolution documents. The paperwork meticulously detailed the termination of the financial vehicle, explicitly citing the irrefutable breach of contract caused by the beneficiary's voluntary, legally recorded identity alteration. I picked up the heavy gold fountain pen Simon offered and smoothly applied my signature to every required line, feeling absolutely no hesitation or lingering parental guilt. I was not stripping an innocent child of her future. I was simply enforcing the exact unyielding boundaries of a legal contract that Sydney had arrogantly and publicly destroyed. The precise moment my pen lifted from the final page, the trust was completely legally annihilated. $250,000 in pure, liquid capital were instantly unfrozen and entirely freed from the restrictive, singular purpose they had been trapped within for over a decade. Simon collected the documents efficiently, verifying the notarized stamps before turning to his secure computer terminal. He looked up at me, his fingers resting lightly on his keyboard, and asked for my routing instructions. He naturally assumed I would simply command him to wire the massive sum directly back into the impenetrable offshore holding company that safely housed the liquid proceeds of my liquidated logistics empire. It was the standard logically sound procedure for protecting reacquired capital. I sat back in the comfortable leather guest chair, looking out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below, and carefully considered the immense power of that newly liberated money. It represented decades of my physical labor, and I absolutely refused to simply hide it away in a dark vault. I instructed Simon to bypass my offshore holding accounts entirely and instead prepare a direct, unalterable wire transfer to the endowment board of a highly prestigious local historically black college and university. Simon paused, his hands hovering over the keyboard, but he remained silently attentive as I detailed the exact parameters of my new directive. I formally established the immediate creation of a targeted, aggressively funded engineering and advanced logistics scholarship program. This capital was not going to sit idly accumulating interest. It was going to be deployed immediately to forge actual futures. I explicitly mandated that the $250,000 be strictly distributed as full-ride grants to highly driven, underprivileged youth who possess the raw intellect and relentless work ethic required to conquer the industry, but completely lacked the wealthy financial backing necessary to access elite higher education. Sydney had been handed a golden ticket to any university on the planet and had arrogantly shredded it to impress a family of parasitic con artists. Therefore, her squandered privilege would be directly transmuted into a massive life-altering weapon for young students who actually understood the profound, undeniable value of a dollar. These future engineers and logistics architects would not inherit their success. They would earn it through grit, late nights, and unyielding determination, exactly as I had painstakingly built my own empire out of nothing 40 years ago. I outlined the strict academic and morality clauses of the new endowment, ensuring the money would only flow to those who demonstrated absolute integrity. I was taking the exact financial fuel my daughter had so carelessly discarded and using it to ignite the potential of an entirely new generation of hungry, brilliant minds who would never take such an opportunity for granted. Simon nodded in absolute respectful understanding and rapidly executed the complex keystrokes required to authorize the massive transfer. I watched the digital confirmation flash across his monitor, officially routing the $250,000 out of my personal sphere and directly into the university's permanent endowment fund. The transaction was complete, irrevocable, and entirely perfect. As the secure system logged the final wire receipt, a deep, profound sense of settling closure washed over me, completely replacing any lingering shadows of parental grief or bitterness. The immense capital I had physically bled for the money generated from decades of exhaust fumes, freezing loading docks, and relentless corporate warfare was finally secured in a place where it would generate true, uncorrupted value. It would permanently secure the academic future of 10 brilliant students, completely altering the trajectory of their lives and rewarding their genuine ambition. I stood up, shook Simon's hand with genuine gratitude, and walked out of the law firm with a remarkably light heart. The crushing, suffocating gravity of the Kensington family and their endless parasitic extortion had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I stepped into the elevator, watching the polished metal doors smoothly slide shut, cutting off the legal world and returning me to my quiet, unburdened existence. I exited the towering glass building and stepped out onto the bustling downtown sidewalk, pulling my heavy wool coat tighter against the biting chill of the winter morning. I had barely taken 10 steps toward the parking garage when my mobile phone suddenly began to vibrate in my inner pocket. I pulled the device out and looked at the illuminated screen. The caller ID flashed brightly, displaying a number I had not seen or acknowledged in months. It was Patricia. I stared at the illuminated screen of my mobile phone, watching Patricia's name flash against the biting cold of the morning air. A year ago, that name would have commanded my immediate attention and a deep, ingrained sense of duty. Now it merely represented the dying gasp of a failed extortion scheme. I pressed the green icon and brought the device to my ear, continuing my steady pace toward my parked vehicle without breaking stride. Patricia did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was an immediate hysterical barrage of weeping and frantic pleading, a chaotic departure from the polished, aristocratic tone she had weaponized in the courtroom. She begged me to intervene with the district attorney, demanding I pick up the phone and force the state to drop the impending perjury and fraud charges immediately. She babbled uncontrollably about the crushing weight of her legal retainers, openly admitting that the initial defense fees had already completely bankrupted her fragile accounts. The predatory lawyers she had hired to seize my assets were now aggressively draining whatever capital she had left to keep her out of a federal penitentiary. Patricia sobbed heavily into the receiver, her breath hitching as she described the sheer paralyzing terror of facing actual prison time. She pleaded with me to show mercy, insisting that a criminal conviction would entirely ruin her carefully curated reputation and leave her utterly destitute on the streets. She expected me to leverage the very fortune she had tried to steal in order to finance her legal salvation. I unlocked my truck, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the heavy door, shutting out the ambient city noise to focus entirely on the sound of her complete, undeniable unraveling. I let her frantic sobbing fill the quiet cabin of my truck for several long seconds before I finally chose to speak. I did not raise my voice, nor did I offer a single syllable of comforting reassurance. I clinically dismantled her fundamental misunderstanding of the extreme legal peril she currently faced. I explained with absolute objective clarity that I possessed no authority whatsoever to drop the criminal charges hovering over her head. This was not a petty civil dispute over alimony or a fabricated lawsuit I had initiated out of spite. The judicial system itself was aggressively prosecuting her because she had willingly sat in a sworn deposition, placed her hand on a Bible, and knowingly committed egregious perjury with the explicit intent to steal my freedom and my wealth. The state had recognized her actions as a highly calculated, malicious assault on the integrity of the court, and the state did not offer forgiveness. I reminded Patricia that she had meticulously orchestrated this entire catastrophic disaster from the very beginning. She had colluded with a known fraudster, manipulated our daughter into severing her own inheritance, and attempted to legally lock me in a psychiatric facility to loot my accounts. She had built the gallows, tied the noose, and eagerly pulled the lever, entirely convinced that my wealth would shield her from any consequences. The profound ignorance of her current request highlighted the exact fatal arrogance that had engineered her downfall. She genuinely believed that she could scheme to destroy my life, fail spectacularly, and then demand I step in to halt the unyielding gears of justice she had intentionally set into motion. Her weeping intensified, shifting from desperate bargaining into a pathetic attempt at emotional manipulation, but her tears landed on an entirely impenetrable surface. I explicitly informed Patricia that her imminent financial ruin and looming incarceration were the direct, unavoidable consequences of her own staggering arrogance. She had waged a brutal, scorched earth campaign driven by pure, unadulterated greed, completely ignoring every opportunity to walk away with her dignity intact when I had offered her silence. I told her that viewing her current devastation invoked absolutely zero pity within me. The woman crying on the other end of the line was a stranger who had viewed my decades of hard physical labor as nothing more than a personal piggy bank waiting to be cracked open. By attempting to strip away my autonomy through a fraudulent conservatorship, she had permanently extinguished any lingering obligation, shared history, or familial empathy I might have harbored. I methodically outlined the absolute finality of our dynamic. There would be no financial rescue, no legal intervention, and no emotional reconciliation to salvage her conscience. The boundaries had been violently crossed, and the bridge between us was completely reduced to ash. I calmly stated that our shared past was entirely irrelevant to the immediate brutal reality she had constructed for herself. I informed her that this was the definitive, uncompromising end of our interaction. I would not entertain her desperate excuses, validate her manufactured victimhood, or act as a shield against the incoming wreckage of her choices. We had absolutely nothing left to discuss, neither today nor at any point in the foreseeable future. The conversation was over and the judgment was absolute. Patricia launched into another frantic, hysterical plea, desperately crying out my name as she tried to salvage the rapidly terminating call. I did not wait for her to finish the desperate sentence. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off her voice mid-sob and plunging the cabin of my truck into absolute brilliant silence. I placed the vehicle in drive and navigated out of the downtown parking sector, ignoring the immediate frantic vibrations of her follow-up calls buzzing against the console. I drove directly to a local telecommunications provider located on the outer edge of the commercial district. I walked up to the counter, handed the clerk my device, and requested an immediate permanent change to my cellular number. Within 10 minutes, the new unlisted digits were securely programmed into the hardware, entirely wiping my digital footprint. I retrieved my old, physical SIM card from the technician and walked back out to the sunlit parking lot. Standing beside my truck, I snapped the tiny piece of plastic entirely in half, dropping the broken gold fragments into a nearby storm drain. That tiny microchip held decades of contacts, toxic obligations, and the final tether to a family that had tried to consume me whole. Its destruction marked an absolute permanent severance from a past that no longer held any power over my existence. I climbed back into the driver's seat and looked at the open highway stretching out beyond the city limits. The immense, sprawling metropolis felt suddenly too small, too saturated with the ghosts of a concluded war. I shifted the gears, deciding at that precise moment to leave the city entirely and build a new sanctuary. The crisp, biting air of the high mountains filled my lungs, carrying the sharp and cleansing scent of ancient pine trees. I stood on the wraparound wooden porch of a secluded timber cabin I had quietly purchased over a decade ago, a private sanctuary completely hidden from the frantic demands of my former corporate life. The smooth, mirrored surface of the alpine lake stretched out endlessly before me, reflecting the brilliant, unbroken blue of the morning sky. I held a thick ceramic mug of black coffee, letting the deep warmth seep into my palms as I breathed in the absolute, unshakable tranquility of my surroundings. The suffocating manufactured chaos of the past few months felt as though it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. There were no shrill phone calls from Patricia demanding extortionate sums of money, no arrogant smirks from Gregory parading his fraudulent wealth, and no deceptive, calculating tears from the daughter who had viewed me as nothing more than a disposable financial asset. The deafening roar of their collective greed had been entirely replaced by the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the dense forest canopy. I had traded the sprawling, toxic battlefield of the city for a fortress of timber and stone surrounded by a natural barrier that no manipulative legal scheme could ever breach. Every breath I took in this isolated haven was a testament to the brutal but necessary surgical extraction I had performed on my own life. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark coffee, savoring the bitter richness on my tongue. The violent storm of deceit had finally passed, leaving behind a pristine landscape swept entirely clean of the parasites that had eagerly tried to consume me. I set my coffee mug on the damp wooden railing and picked up my encrypted tablet, illuminating the high-resolution screen to review the final, definitive pieces of the wreckage they had brought upon themselves. The local financial news cycle had heavily documented the spectacular, deeply humiliating collapse of Gregory's fabricated empire. A brief clinical article confirmed that his luxury auto dealership had been officially and permanently seized by the regional bank. The glittering showroom was now padlocked and entirely empty after his violent creditors violently stripped the remaining inventory to satisfy his massive illicit debts. Gregory was currently facing a mountain of insurmountable civil litigation and total absolute bankruptcy, entirely isolated from the high society circles he had so desperately tried to infiltrate. A separate federal justice registry provided the stark, undeniable conclusion to Wyatt's criminal trajectory. Facing a mountain of irrefutable digital evidence and severe federal charges, the young fraudster had cowardly folded, accepting a harsh plea deal for aggravated wire fraud to avoid a lengthy trial. He was currently wearing a standard-issue uniform and serving mandatory time in a federal penitentiary, completely stripped of his designer suits and his arrogant tech visionary persona. Finally, a brief, highly discreet report from my private investigator detailed Sydney's current self-inflicted reality. The former heiress was now working a grueling minimum-wage retail job on the opposite side of the city, spending 8 hours a day on her feet, folding cheap garments just to scrape together enough cash to cover the monthly rent on a cramped, poorly insulated apartment. She had willingly abandoned a life of absolute security and a fully funded university education for a cheap, temporary illusion. Now she was experiencing the crushing, uncompromising weight of genuine poverty. I locked the tablet screen and placed it face down on the small wooden patio table, reflecting deeply on the precise, methodical nature of my ultimate victory. I had not won this brutal war by matching their hysterical aggression or engaging in toxic emotional shouting matches. I realized with absolute clarity that my complete, unwavering silence had been my most devastating and highly effective weapon. By entirely refusing to react to their escalating provocations by denying them the frantic, pleading father they expected to easily exploit, I had created a massive silent void that their own unbridled arrogance rushed to fill. They were so fundamentally blinded by their insatiable greed and their arrogant assumption of my inherent weakness that they had boldly marched onto a battlefield entirely of my own choosing. I did not have to actively destroy Patricia Gregory or Wyatt. I simply had to step back, legally secure my vast assets, and allow their own inherent corruption to run its natural, highly destructive course. They had eagerly woven their own noose using threads of perjury, wire fraud, and predatory commercial loans, fully believing they were constructing an untouchable empire. Every arrogant insult they hurled, every fraudulent legal document they signed, and every stolen dollar they aggressively transferred merely tightened the trap they had meticulously built for themselves. My stoic silence was never a symptom of defeat or passive acceptance. It was the calculated, lethal patience of a man watching a pack of starving wolves run blindly off the edge of a jagged cliff while aggressively snapping at a phantom piece of meat. I had defeated them by simply letting the uncompromising machinery of truth and legal consequence operate without a single ounce of interference. I allowed myself a brief, fleeting moment to acknowledge the profound, undeniable pain of losing my only daughter to such a catastrophic moral failure. It is a deeply unnatural grief to mourn a child who is still actively breathing, to accept that the little girl I had tirelessly protected had willingly mutated into a ruthless, calculating stranger. Yet that sharp pang of sorrow was immediately tempered by the cold, liberating truth that she had never truly respected me as a father or a human being. She had only ever valued my utility as a silent, compliant financial provider. In exchange for permanently severing that deeply toxic, parasitic bond, I had regained something infinitely more valuable. I had successfully reclaimed my total, absolute freedom, my unshakable personal dignity, and a profound peace of mind that no amount of stolen money could ever purchase. I was no longer a host to be drained, or a target to be relentlessly manipulated by entitled strangers. I smiled, a genuine expression of quiet contentment that reached my eyes and permanently powered down the encrypted tablet. I picked up my polished graphite fishing rod, leaning against the timber railing, slung my canvas tackle box over my shoulder, and began the slow, rhythmic walk down the wooden steps toward the pristine edge of the alpine lake. The morning sun finally crested the towering mountain peaks, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the rippling, crystal-clear water. I inhaled the fresh, cleansing breeze, feeling completely and entirely whole. The absolute, truest form of power in this world does not come from aggressively crushing your enemies or hoarding vast wealth. The truest form of power is knowing with absolute certainty that you owe absolutely nothing to the people who chose to betray you. I did not raise my voice or offer any physical comfort to the trembling young woman standing on my porch. The freezing rain continued to whip around her fragile frame, but I remained an immovable barrier against the elements she had brought to my doorstep. I simply looked at her smeared makeup and soaked designer clothing, letting the heavy silence stretch between us until her frantic apologies completely died out. When the only sound left was the violent wind, I asked her a single clinical question. I instructed her to look me directly in the eyes and clearly state her full current legal name. Sydney visibly flinched as if I had struck her. She hesitated, her jaw trembling violently as the freezing rain plastered her ruined hair to her pale cheeks. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She knew exactly what the admission meant. Finally, choking on a fresh wave of desperate sobs, she cried out that she was officially Sydney Kensington. The stolen surname hung in the icy air, a permanent monument to her ultimate betrayal. The moment the name left her lips, she frantically lunged forward, grabbing the heavy wooden doorframe as she swore to reverse the damage. She promised wildly that she would be standing outside the municipal courthouse the exact second it opened tomorrow morning. She swore she would file the paperwork, pay the administrative fees, and legally change her name back to Rollins. She begged me to accept the gesture as proof of her renewed loyalty, pleading that a simple legal document did not define her true family. She desperately tried to erase months of calculated cruelty with a single panicked promise, hoping my parental affection would override the undeniable reality of her choices. I did not accept her frantic bargaining or acknowledge her sudden, convenient desperation to reclaim her heritage. I kept my posture entirely rigid, meeting her tear-filled gaze with the clinical detachment of a judge delivering a final verdict. I calmly informed her that genuine respect and familial loyalty are not simply garments you can casually discard when the sun is shining and frantically throw back on the moment a storm arrives. I explained that she had not made a temporary mistake or a fleeting error in judgment. She had executed a calculated, methodical, and legally binding decision to completely eradicate my identity from her life. She had willingly stood before a judge and renounced her own legacy, eagerly severing herself from the bloodline that had provided for her every need since the day she was born. I reminded her of the absolute ease with which she had traded her authentic family history for the hollow, glittering illusion of the Kensington Empire. She had eagerly tossed me aside when she believed I was just a useless, obsolete old man, lacking the glamorous wealth and elite status she so desperately craved. She had laughed in a deposition room, perfectly willing to lock me inside a psychiatric ward just to secure her own financial independence. I methodically laid out the stark reality of her actions, ensuring she completely understood that her current tears were born of financial ruin, not moral regret. She had chosen her new family with absolute certainty when the sky was clear and the bank vault seemed full. Now that the Kensington illusion had violently shattered and the money had completely vanished, she was simply running back to the only viable shelter left. I let the cold reality of her absolute betrayal settle into the freezing space between us. Sydney stood completely paralyzed, the desperate bargaining dying in her throat as she realized I was completely immune to her emotional manipulation. I spoke with a quiet, undeniable finality, telling her that in the adult world she had so eagerly tried to conquer actions carried permanent, irreversible consequences. The protective bubble I had maintained around her entire existence had been permanently popped by her own hands, and I would not artificially inflate it again. I reached into the inside pocket of my tailored vest and extracted a small, rigid piece of plastic. I held it out into the rain. It was a prepaid key card for an extended stay hotel located on the other side of the city, fully funded for exactly 7 days. Sydney stared at the plastic card, her hands shaking so violently she could barely lift her arm to take it from my grasp. I explicitly informed her that this was the absolute final financial transaction she would ever receive from the Rollins estate. The card provided her with 1 single week of a dry bed and a locked door. After those 7 days expired, she would be entirely responsible for her own survival. I told her that she needed to discover the true value of $1, the crushing weight of a heating bill, and the uncompromising reality of earning a living. I instructed her to go out and build her own life entirely from nothing, brick by brick, utilizing her own sweat and endurance, exactly as I had done 40 years ago when I started my logistics company with empty pockets and a singular vision. Sydney clutched the plastic hotel keycard against her soaked chest, her eyes wide with the crushing, terrifying realization that her safety net was permanently gone. She opened her mouth, desperately searching for one final argument, one last emotional trigger that could bridge the massive chasm she had carved between us. I did not give her the opportunity to speak. I looked at the daughter I had fiercely loved and tirelessly protected for over 2 decades, feeling the absolute finality of our severed bond. I simply told her goodbye. The word carried no malice, no lingering rage, and no hidden invitation for future reconciliation. It was an entirely objective conclusion to a closed chapter. I stepped backward into the warm, illuminated foyer and slowly pushed the heavy oak door shut. The thick wood smoothly sealed out the violent roar of the wind, the freezing rain, and the pathetic, muffled sounds of Sydney's continued sobbing. I reached out and engaged the heavy brass deadbolt, the sharp metallic click echoing decisively through the empty entrance hall. I turned my back on the entryway and walked steadily down the corridor, feeling the tension permanently drain from my shoulders with every step. I returned to my quiet, dimly lit study, the fire still crackling cheerfully in the stone hearth. The sprawling mansion was now completely silent, but the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of anticipation or the empty, echoing void of a fractured family. It was a profound, unshakable, and fiercely protective peace. I was finally truly alone, and the fortress was completely secure. True power resides not in the endless accumulation of wealth, but in the absolute mastery of personal boundaries. When confronted with deep betrayal by those we fiercely protected, the most devastating response is a complete withdrawal of our presence. Anger and bargaining only validate their sick entitlement. By enforcing total silence and redirecting our vital resources toward those who possess genuine merit, we strip the abusers of perceived control. Ultimate peace is firmly secured, the exact moment we clearly recognize that our lifelong sacrifices owe absolutely nothing to ungrateful parasites, proving that unyielding dignity remains the only permanent human currency. If you found value in this lesson of resilience and boundaries, please leave a comment like this content and subscribe for more compelling stories of reclaiming personal dignity.